Good morning. Good morning. On behalf of Tuolumne County Alliance for Resources and the Environment, better known as TuCare, welcome. Welcome to the 21st Annual Natural Resources Summit. We started this back when Dave Cogdill was our assemblyman. So it's been going on for a long time. We have a spectacular group of speakers today. My name is Jeff Sargo. I'll be your MC today. The TuCare Board of Directors has recognized that fire is the largest threat to our community. And so the theme for this event, making our community fire safe, is both timely and appropriate. A word you're going to hear a lot about today is called resilience. And we all would like to see our community more and more resilient. TuCare had to be resilient this week. The MC for this event was supposed to be our former Supervisor Randy Hanfeld, who is also the president of TuCare, but COVID got in the way. So, he came down with COVID last weekend, and his wife, Gloria, came down with it middle of the week. So he's wished us well, and he is doing well. He's got some therapeutics, and he's recovering. So, likewise, we were all shocked middle of the week to hear that Glenn Gottschall, our past president and former forest supervisor on the Stanislaus, had a heart attack. He was to be one of our presenters today, and he's doing well. Likewise, he's got good care. I believe it's Mercy Hospital in Sacramento he's at. He's sitting up, talking, doing well. So everything seems to be progressing well there. Adam Freeze has agreed to step in for him and fill in his slot today. This event, like everything else that TuCare does and many community events, would not be possible without the financial and other types of support that we receive. We especially want to thank PG&E. PG&E obviously is kind of involved in the fire business these days, and they would like to see all of us fireproof our houses as much as possible and reduce the liability there. They have funded this in a large way every year for years. Likewise, we'd like to thank Randolph Holter, who owns Clark Broadcasting, our local radio stations, who provide us with tremendous support for all our events. At the end of the building down here, you'll find some treats, water, coffee, and bathrooms in the back there. We are not going to take a break mid-morning because we're going to try to get through 12 speakers today. So if you feel the need, stretch your legs, get something to eat, and feel free. We've assembled an impressive amount of individuals today. Going to talk about the current affairs that we find ourselves in and what has been done, what's being done, and what can be done. We've got a total of 12 speakers to get through by 1 o'clock, so we need to get started. And Ginger is going to be our timekeeper. She's going to keep us on schedule. So we want to make sure that everything that we do and say today is well received. So we are going to have Anaya Kirk, who is the Tuolumne County Supervisor for District 3, come and do the invocation.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you guys for being here today. And I was thinking about what prayer to pray, but a few years ago I was reading the Bible with my kids, and we were reading the book of Genesis, which they love, and we got to the chapter where God put Adam and Eve in the garden, and the kids thought it was so cool that Adam and Eve had a garden, so I had to go plant a garden for my kids, and now we do it every season. But, I want to read it so I don't butcher it, but one of the first things that God gave man to do was to take and tend the land. So it says in Genesis 2, the Lord God took man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it. And so today we got a lot of experts in the room. We got a lot of wisdom, a lot of knowledge. And I think we're just going back to the basics. How do we take care of the land that God's provided for us? I've heard it said multiple times. There's in my garden, if I don't pick the weeds, they take over. And when the weeds take over, things die. And so we're seeing that take place in our forests. But I think the times have changed, and we're going to hopefully see some good change moving into the future. So with that being said, I'm going to say a little prayer. So Lord, we thank you for this land that you've given to us to manage and to care and take care of. I pray for all the people in this room, all the agencies that represent this event. I ask for wisdom. I ask for knowledge moving into the future. From the state level, from the federal level, all the way down, I pray for our leaders that you would give them ears to hear, Lord, and eyes to see, and that doesn't matter what side of the aisle you're on, that we would come together and see change to make our community safe and fire resilient. I pray for the first responders that deal with this during the fire season, that you protect them. I pray for our little town, our little city, our little Tuolumne County, that you would keep your hand of protection on us as we work these things out and as we work to make a more fire resilient community. Lord, in your name we thank you, and God bless you all. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you.
Thank you.
If I could have the members of the first panel come up, Patrick Wright, Adam Freeze, Dory Beats, To begin the program, we're going to have a panel of 3 individuals addressing creating a fire-resilient community. Panel consists of Patrick Wright, who is the director of the California Wildfire and Forest Resiliency Task; Adam Freeze, who is the unit forester for Tuolumne Calaveras unit of CAL FIRE; and Dory Beats, who is the Office of Emergency Services Coordinator for Tuolumne County. Before each speaker speaks, before anybody speaks, we're going to do the Pledge of Allegiance. Where is the flag? Right there. Everybody would stand, please. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Each speaker will have 15 minutes to speak, and then we'll have 5 minutes for questions. If you wish to submit a question, pick up a card at the information table at the end down here, and we will attempt to get that answered. If you will put an email address on that, and we are not able to get to that question, we will give that to the speakers, and they can respond to you. I want to thank Ginger Armstrong. She's our timekeeper today, former executive director, one of the first for TuCare, back in the day, so to speak. Okay. Before each speaker speaks, I'll read a short bio, and please welcome them. We'll begin with Patrick Wright. Patrick Wright is the director of the California Wildfire and Forest Resiliency Task Force, where he has led the development of the state's Wildfire and Forest Resilience Action Plan. He was previously executive director for the California Tahoe Conservancy, served as director for the CalFed Bay Delta Program, and deputy secretary of the California Resources Agency in the Davis administration. Prior to these appointments, he was a senior policy advisor to the regional administrator of the EPA and the deputy secretary of Interior, and held positions in EPA's air and water management programs in San Francisco. Patrick, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'll try to keep things brief because the questions are always the most fun about this. And thank you for that great introduction. I'm really happy to be here. Like many of you, I've been on the job a little bit more than a year, and this is my 2nd or 3rd visit. But this was one I didn't want to pass up because there's nothing like getting out and seeing people firsthand, hearing about their challenges, their opportunities, et cetera. When I took on this job, I took on it, like I said, about a little bit more than a year ago. There was a forest management task force that many of you might have heard of that grew out of the old tree mortality task force. And it was moving along for a year or two. Recommendations were starting to slowly come in. So I took over the position, and I sat down with Secretary Crowfoot in the governor's office and said, maybe we ought to do something a little bit different here. Instead of giving the governor's office yet another set of recommendations on top of those that are coming in from think tanks and from the legislature and from advocacy groups, why don't we actually pull together all the agencies, state, federal, local, tribal, and pull together a plan with real targets and real actions, not an aspirational plan that sits on a shelf, but something that really connects everything we're doing and drives us forward. So that's what we did last year. We published this document. It's short and sweet, not a lot of pages, full of specific actions. It's called the state's Wildfire and Forest Resilience Action Plan. Includes 99 specific actions with lead agencies for every single one. to try to increase the pace and scale of what we're doing and to try to do a much better job of coordinating the work of CAL FIRE, the Forest Service, local agencies, tribal agencies. So we came out with that again in January together with the governor's proposed $1 billion budget so that it was clear that the budget was backed by an actual strategy, an actual framework. And so most of my time for the last several months has been trying to position ourselves as a team to try to get that done. I made the pitch to change our governance structure. The old task force was state-driven. My pitch again to the governor's office was the state is not what's driving projects in California. They're being driven locally by local collaboratives, by local Forest Service districts, local CAL FIRE districts. Let's revamp the task force. Let's have it co-led by federal, state, local, and tribal. So now we have a new task force executive committee at the local level. The members are the heads of CSAC and RCRC. Many of you know those folks who have been a really important voice for local government. And certainly sounding the message now that particularly in the Sierra and other places, local governments are really hurting between COVID, between the smoke, the fires, the park closures. So we're trying to do everything we can to get out more to local areas like this so that we can hear directly from local elected officials and others. So speaking of the plan, I think the number one effort overall, as you may have heard, is to increase the pace and scale of our work collectively to get to 1 million acres treated by 2025. That's a big challenge. That's more than a doubling from where we are now. But the governor and the Forest Service are committed to do everything we can to try to get there. We're getting there through a combination of more aggressive statewide strategies on things like prescribed fire, reforestation, workforce, wood utilization. We've got folks working to try to unlock all of those. But most importantly, as I said before, we're trying to send more money and beef up the capacity of regional and local networks. We've got under the states, for instance, Regional Fire and Forest Capacity Program, over $100 million in the state's budget solely for planning and capacity building of local collaboratives to be able to increase their ability to get their work done. And certainly in this region, you've got one of the most high-performing of those collaboratives led by Yosemite Stanislaus Solutions. You've got Jason Kiken here, who's one of the most seeking Forest Service folks who really gets it, the importance of working local and thinking out 5, 10, 20 years where we need to be. So it's really served as a model for a lot of the other parts of the state of how state and federal and local folks are working together to try to get the job done. Our hope over time as these regional frameworks come together and lead the way as each one develops a set of assessments of their landscapes, of their targets, of where they need to go. They develop a pipeline of projects. Rather than funding those projects individually through grants to Sacramento, which is often the way we do things, to shift towards block grants to regional entities who know what they're doing and get out of the way. We pioneered that in a couple of areas in Lake Tahoe and the North Coast. Again, I think this area may be one of the first out the door. Well, you'll get a block grant from the state coordinated with the Forest Service money, so you can develop a sustained program. What we're hearing from everybody throughout the state is that one of the biggest challenges is if you're relying on competitive grants, you can't hire the workforce, the contractors, the crews, you can't do the planning. What we need from you is a 5 to 10 year vision, and once that 5 to 10 year vision is developed, we need to be able to back it up with money that's going to last 5 to 10 years so that you can actually sustain a program rather than suffer the ups and downs that go with competitive grants, and also the level of work it takes to try to do that. So that's the idea, that's the vision, is to really try to shift more and more to regional frameworks, but also develop a way so that these regional frameworks can roll up at the state level so that we can educate the legislature, the governor, folks in Washington, what we're achieving collectively as a state. So it's tricky to pull off because there's a lot of precedent in California for state programs that direct local agencies, whether it's transportation planning or schools or whatever to say, if you meet these requirements, money will flow. We're trying to be as flexible as possible, knowing that each region in the state has a different set of priorities. If you're in the Eastern Sierra, you're going to put more emphasis on recreation than you might in another part of the state where timber harvest or stream zone passage or other issues are more important. So the real challenge we have at the state level is, can we come up with a statewide framework that allows each region to prioritize? That, again, is not easy to do, particularly in a place like Sacramento and in a regulatory world where consistency is always usually the mantra, but we're going to fight hard to give local agencies the flexibility they need to hit their priorities as we move forward. The good news, I guess, on several fronts, one, again, is on funding. The state's budget has gone from roughly $200 million a year up to $1.5 billion this year between what was called early action budget and this year's $1 billion budget. Again, our goal is to try to make that a sustained level of funding over time. We'll see how successful we get with that. But I do think we've reached a tipping point between the state's budget and the fires, where I think folks in Sacramento and Washington are now getting it, that we need to ramp up 5-fold, 10-fold at a sustained level if we're really going to get a handle on this issue. Second, I think there's also increased recognition that the state and federal agencies are not going to be able to handle it alone. We're all very capacity constrained, particularly at the federal level with staff and the state level. So increasingly what you're going to see is more partnerships through mechanisms under federal law called the Good Neighbor Agreement and stewardship agreements, so that local entities, counties, tribes, state agencies can do work on federal land, can do work on state land, can do all lands projects. Because we're just not going to be able to handle it at the state and federal level. We're going to need the locals to step up and lead the way, again, hopefully with block grants helping you get there. Third, I think there's been, candidly, a big change in mindset just in the last couple of years on the need to streamline the regulatory processes. There's a new effort in California called CalVTP that was intended to shorten the amount of time it takes to do Sql review for forest health projects from, 2 or 3 years to 2 or 3 months by simply having a checklist. That's just been launched in the last 6 months to a year. The jury's still out on how effective it's going to be, but I think I've been surprised, candidly, at how forceful the governor and others have been about cutting through the red tape. There's a new Sql exemption that's in the state budget that exempts all restoration projects, for example, from Sql entirely. Now, believe me, that was not uncontroversial. You had a lot of advocacy groups, freaked out over that, but it got through. It passed in the state's budget. It's going to be used in very limited circumstances to prove the way. But I think you're seeing this administration take some steps on the regulatory scene that I wouldn't have imagined a couple of years ago. So that's good news. So we got money, we're commitment to building local capacity, commitment to regulatory reform, and then finally commitment to scale up through partnerships. We can no longer afford a situation where the Forest Service is taking care of its land, state parks its land, county its land, et cetera. We've really got to work together and we got to scale up. In Lake Tahoe, where I'm from, we did for years and years after the Angora fire. We did what anybody would do. We mapped out all the vulnerable communities around the lake and we hit those neighborhoods that were the highest. And then we discovered if we keep doing that, it's going to take 10 or 20 years to get around the lake. And so we switched. And now we're doing large landscape projects that are 50, 60,000 acres at a time, trying to work with the regulatory agencies to see if we can pull that off. It's not easy. And it's not so much because there are differences among the interest groups around the lake or in other regions in the state. Candidly, the big challenge is getting the agencies to work together. It's not so much that they disagree, but if you're state parks, you're the Forest Service, you're a conservancy, Wildlife Conservation Board, Fish and Wildlife, you all have your own cultures and your own rules and your own regs. To try to get those aligned is a big challenge. But again, I think this is one of the few areas, candidly, in the state where you figured that out to some degree. You are scaling up, and so I applaud you for that effort, and we're going to continue to look to this area and others as we move towards empowering local and regional groups to do what they can to scale up across the board. So again, I'm really delighted to be here. Love to talk to you folks after the session about some of your key challenges and issues, but I hope that gives you at least a little bit of a flavor of where we're going. Thanks again.
Thank you, Patrick. Our next speaker is Adam Fries. Local guy done great, you know. Adam Fries is Unit Forester for Tuolumne Calaveras Unit of CAL FIRE. He has worked for CAL FIRE since 1999, starting at the Magalia Reforestation Center in Butte Unit, working in Mendocino Unit as a forester and crew captain. Adam has worked in the private sector as a forestry technician for Fiberboard and H&W Forestry here in Tuolumne County. He graduated with a degree in Forest Resource and Management from the University of Montana. Mr. Adam, you're up.
Thank you guys for having me here today. Just hit the arrow to make this go forward. All right, I'm going to be talking about reducing fuels. And just real quick, hit a few things. Why fuel reduction is important. Going to hit on what CAL FIRE is doing, what you can do, and some places where folks can get some help. So, why is fuel reduction important? Some of you folks have seen these pictures before, but this is a typical western forest around the turn of the century, around 1900. You can see that the forest was real open and park-like. It's mostly pine, which is really resistant to fire. It thrives on disturbance, thrives on fire, has real thick, platy bark that has kind of the same technology as when the space shuttle's coming back in the atmosphere where the surface gets hot. It's a blade of bark where that peels off, exposes a cool surface. So it's really thick, and these stands are really resilient and really designed for these fires to come through. Fires that come through back then about every 7 to 14 years, and we know this because from not only from people studying growth rings and fire scars and whatnot, but it wasn't that long ago. So there's historical documentation of it. There's photographs of it. So these fires that come through during this time period, it was a high frequency of fires, but low intensity. So low flame lengths. And like I said, these stands thrived on disturbance. There's one of the most important things to pass on from this is there's really three things that influence fire behavior. There's the weather and the topography and the fuels. The weather we're stuck with. There's nothing I can do about that. If a fire was coming and I could make it rain, I would do it every time. Can't do it. The topography we're stuck with. So out of that equation, the fuels is the one piece that we can do something about. So, okay, this is the same stand, 1948. Just because we don't do anything doesn't mean that nothing happens. This ground that we live on is super productive. Whether we do anything or not, it's going to grow and change. It's not going to stay the same. So this is that same stand. About 40 years later, you can see it's a lot more density. Change of species composition. You can see a lot of shade-tolerant species growing in. And you could see where if a fire started on the ground, it wouldn't stay on the ground here. It would get in, we call these ladder fuels, it get into the next tree, and then pretty soon be up in the canopy of the trees. And this is the same stand again, 40 years after that, 1989. You can't even hardly see these bigger pine trees anymore. A fire in this, compare this to the first picture where a fire starting in that first stand that you saw would be easy to put out. Low intensity, low flame lengths. Someone with a shovel and a back pump could probably put that out. A fire in this stand is going to grow rapidly, and it's going to be resistant to any control efforts. So 1989 to me seems like it was not very long ago, but it was. If we had a picture of this same stand today, it would be even worse, and probably one thing you'd see in here that's not in this picture is a big dead component. Again, things don't stay the same. They're always changing. So what's CAL FIRE doing? We're trying, we've been really active and constructing strategic fuel breaks. This is a picture of our Murphy's fuel break that on the tour we went and looked at yesterday. And you can see it looks like that first picture. Trees are spaced out. A fire on the ground would be low intensity. This is a place we can get in and work. One of the things I said yesterday that's really important to note is that these fuel breaks aren't meant to be on the map and then stand alone and we never have to go there again. A fire's going to burn up to them and go out. These are just a place for us to work off of. So we're still going to have to go in and work, but it's a place where we can be really productive. How we get this work done? We're really fortunate here in Tuolumne and Calaveras County. We have a lot of great cooperators that are aggressively putting in for grants. We have fire safe councils, resource conservation districts, local governments. Both counties have been really engaged. So we have outstanding cooperators who are aggressively seeking grants. And if you look at a map of where all these projects are, the bulk of them have been done through the grant process, at least initially, where one of our cooperators is put in for a grant, not necessarily a CAL FIRE grant, could be Stevens grant through Forest Service or PG&E, but the community is really engaged and to get this work done. We have a lot as mentioned earlier about the pace and scale. Over the last several years, there's been a lot of emphasis for the local units to do a lot of this work. So we do a lot. Most of the work that we focus on is maintenance of existing fuel breaks. Like I said, once these fuel breaks are put in, you're not done. It's like painting the Golden Gate Bridge. You get done, and then you have to go back and start at the other end and go back and do it again because this ground is really productive and it wants to grow. So maintenance is huge, and these original projects were put in strategic spots. Where the location of these projects is really driven by the topography. Fires want to run up to the top of the ridge. That's our best place to catch them, so that's where we invest most of our efforts doing this work. But it's really important to maintain the work once it's been done. So we've put in a lot of effort in maintaining. We've received a lot of equipment, especially since all the tree mortality. So historically, where we've done projects just by our inmate crews going out, cutting brush, piling, making piles, and we're left with a giant backlog of piles to burn during the wintertime. We've received masticators and some track chippers that have really helped us on the shoulders of the seasons, where instead of making piles, we're treating that fuel. That's really helped us be more productive. Another way that we do work is through our vegetation management plans, where we enter into contracts with private landowner and do prescribed burning. And we've really, especially in recent years, increased the amount of work we're doing there. A law change that happened a few years ago that's been a huge plus for us is those plans used to be good for 3 years, and now they're good for 10. So it really has allowed us, instead of doing paperwork and preparing more plans, to be able to do more work on the ground. We do a lot of defensible space inspections. That's where you're required around your residence to clear the 100 feet. We put a lot of effort into inspecting. And then we've had an addition of a fuels crew who is dedicated to just doing work on the ground so they're not getting pulled off on fires. So that's been a huge addition. So what can you do? I get a lot of calls from folks, at least once a week, people saying, hey, my property is a disaster, and what are you going to do about it? The person responsible for reducing fuels on your property is you. And I know there's a lot of folks in this room that are done, actively done that work, but you are responsible for reducing the fuels on your property. If you're fortunate enough to be in one of those strategic locations, there's a great chance for, a fire safe counselor or us or someone to come in and do that work. But at the end of the day, you are the one who's responsible for your property. So take the time and do that work. Another way to help is to give permission to if you are in one of those strategic spots, for a group to come in and do that work, whether it's CAL FIRE or a resource conservation district or Fire Safe Council, these folks that get these grants. you'd not believe how much time is spent trying to convince people to let us work on their property. And it's key for when these fuel breaks that they're consistent. So there's not a lot of gaps in them. There's going to be here and there, but the more properties sign on to do that work, the more effective that fuel break's going to be. Another thing you can do once the work's done is maintain it. As I said, we spend a lot of time going back maintaining fuel breaks. That if after we do that heavy lift, if the landowner just put a little bit of effort in and maintain it, we could work on more places instead of going back and hanging on to what we already have. So that's another thing that you can do. And then don't do the right thing the wrong way. You'd not believe how many people are burning piles in August and September. It never fails when there's a red flag warning, around July or August. People run out and go, oh man, I better go out and mow, or or get my weed eating done. At that time, it's really too late. So so don't wait till afternoon in August to get your weed eating done. Okay, I got 5 minutes, so I'm going to skip. This is just some on defensible space. So here's some place you can get some help. Like I said, the person responsible to do this work is you, but there's a lot of great resources out there where you can get help. Fire safe councils, like I said, in both counties are super engaged and are always looking for projects to work on. Our resource conservation districts in both counties are also engaged and actively seeking grants. The CFIT program that CAL FIRE runs is a cost share program where we enter in to cost share agreements with landowners, and we reimburse about 90% for, it's not necessarily fuel reduction work, but it's if your land is, if you have more than 25 acres, it's covered with brush, you want to clear that brush, spray it, and get it back in production where you're growing trees. This is a good program. NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service, has a program that complements that. The management plan that you get done for CFIP works with the NRCS program, and sometimes they have funding, sometimes we have funding, so they both pay for practices. Firewise communities are a great resource for, it's kind of like a framework for neighbors to work with neighbors, help each other out to reduce fuels or reduce hazards in their neighborhoods. So it's really neighbors working together, helping each other out. And then at that readyforwildfire.org, there's always a lot of good information. So, all right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam. And our wrap-up speaker for this panel is Dory Beets. Dory is an enrolled member of the Tuolumne Band of Miwok Indians. She understands the complexities of local, state, tribal, and federal governments and the need to foster better communication between partners and various agencies. Dory is the Office of Emergency Services Coordinator for Tuolumne County, where she is involved in not only emergency preparedness, coordination of county emergency services, but serves as staff to the Board of Supervisors Fire Safety Advisory Committee, Natural Resources Committee, the Water Policy Committee. She works on various issues to make Tuolumne County safer and resilient. She also knows a lot about fire-safe communities. Dory.
Ooh, thank you, Jeff. And I'm a former TuCare board member, so I am a big supporter. So, Michuksus Kochi Ama Kaneoyeshe Dory Beets, thank you so much for having me and inviting me to speak with you today. I am the current Office of Emergency Services Coordinator for Tuolumne County, first ever that they've had a full-time position, and I have been busy. See Jason nodding his head, because yes, I've been on 10 months now, so, and I've seen pretty much every potential disaster to a certain extent we have worked on within our office. I wanted to talk a few things, and I'll slip to the slide, really about the increasing impacts from natural disasters that really underscore the need for our communities to plan, to mitigate, and respond to multiple risks. Statistics are showing that in coming years we may experience shorter, wetter winters, warmer, drier summers. This has the potential to exacerbate the extended current drought cycle and also fire season. So planning fire adaptive communities and mitigating the impact of wildfire is crucial to protecting residents and reducing emergency management costs. Adam spoke about a lot of the fire projects that are existing in the wonderful cooperation. Tuolumne County is a partner to many of those projects. We support the U.S. Forest Service and CERL, YSS. We are a supporter of those large-scale projects. Liz Peterson within my office works a lot on that. We work a lot within OES on defensible space and tree mortality, looking for funding for individual and private property owners. Many of our residents, as you know, here in Tuolumne County cannot afford to go out and do their own fuels reduction on their property, so we're always looking for funding to assist and work with that. We support Tuolumne Fire Safe Council and their endeavors with community wildfire protection planning and all of the projects that they are working on. We are also a huge advocate, and Adam mentioned it at FireWise. We are a big supporter of developing FireWise communities. I don't think Karen's here today, but I think we're at 13 officially approved FireWise communities here within Tuolumne County, which is huge. And it's a great opportunity, as Adam said, for individuals and communities to work together to make their community, their cul-de-sac, their homeowners association FireWise. And so it's really, really great to see that. But one of the things that we really want to work on, in addition to what has been highlighted at a regional, state level, and even across our counties, is that we have to do better at preparing. The wildfires continue to increase. The severity and the catastrophic wildfires in California continue to increase. And as Adam gets phone calls about who's responsible for clearing vegetation, I get phone calls about, how are you going to lead me outside of my house when there's an event? What are you going to do to help me in the event of a wildfire? And so we really want to talk a little bit about the importance of that wildfire preparedness and some of the things that we think you as an individual, but also, did we lose? Nope, can you hear me? All right, good. Sorry, I'm a loud talker anyway, so it just sounded like I wasn't hearing it back. Is that we want to really focus on not only community preparedness, but individual preparedness. One of our goals within the Office of Emergency Services is really to push that individual responsibility. And as Adam spoke about, the individual responsibility for you as a homeowner and property owner, it is also your responsibility to have a plan, to make sure that you have a go bag and what that looks like, putting all that important information, something that you can grab within 5 minutes and leave. It may be a structure fire, but it also may be a wildfire. Obviously, recently we had the Washington fire where folks did not have much notice to get out and evacuate. And it is so important to have that. I like to make it a game. Take your family, your kids, your grandkids, and wake them up one night when they don't have a test the next day or something important. But wake them up in the middle of the night at 12 and say, hey, you got 5 minutes. Get your stuff, get in the car, and let's take a route. Pick a different route each time so you know how to get out of your community. We have many communities in Tuolumne County that only have one way in and one way out. And that is very difficult for a lot of our residents. And when you're half asleep and you've got someone knocking on your door, or you might hear, notification, we want you to be ready for that. And so that means take the time now when it isn't chaotic, when it isn't an actual emergency, to practice that. Knowing what those routes of egress are, it's really important. You'll hear the sheriff and I speak a lot, and right now it's a huge discussion amongst many of our homeowners associations and many of our residents who want to know what evacuation route to take. And we aren't inclined to designate an evacuation route, but we do want you to understand what the egress routes are from your community, your neighborhood, and it's really, really important. We also want you to participate and sign up for our emergency alert. We use Everbridge. We are continuously looking at other ways to alert the general public. But if you don't sign up for that system, then we can't notify you when we need to. And it's really important that everyone goes in and signs up and follows the prompts about how you want to be notified, whether it's your cell phone, your email, your house phone. It's really, really important that we get everyone to do the emergency alert notification. Also, we really ask that you work with your family, your friends, your neighborhood for those that are in need. Again, our population in Tuolumne County, we have a lot of elder folks and folks that are living on their own and often get left behind. And so working with them to support them, even those with access and functional needs, it is really, really important to help our communities and that we can be more resilient. Paying attention to those official pages. We get calls all the time. There's multiple, as many of you know, both Calaveras, Tuolumne County, there's multiple incident feeds, and there are folks in there that want to tell you what's going on and where to go. I cannot stress, you need to listen to the official pages. Go to the sheriff's page, go to our page, go to CAL FIRE's page, Facebook, social media, those types of reliable resources that are going to have the most accurate information. We also want to make sure you're turning into local radio. We try to work with our local radio, Clark Broadcasting, and the Union Democrat and My Mother Lode to make sure we get up the most important and up-to-date information. My dear friend over there, Emily Kilgore, who is staffing the CAL FIRE booth, serves as the PIO, the Public Information Officer, and she does a phenomenal job making sure that things are out there to the media as soon as they're needed. And she helps support our office when we're needed. It's needed as well. I just have a couple of resources so that you can see, and we do have a booth as well as information. Tracy Williams from our office. Tracy, raise your hand. She's over there hanging out. We do have a community preparedness web map, and this is really great. We are improving this system with our Tuolumne County GIS to put some of those egress routes into some of those communities, but you can go and search your particular community, print out the map, and kind of use that if need be to practice your evacuation. We also have an evacuation pamphlet that we've updated in concert both with CAL FIRE and the Sheriff's Office. We have that over at our booth. We have plenty of those, and you can print them and download as well from our website. And then we also have a link here for emergency alert notification, as well as a pamphlet over there about how to sign up for the emergency alert notification. You can also do it on your phone. Just go to your mobile app, search Everbridge, type in Tuolumne County Emergency Alert, and it'll pop right up, and you can sign up right there. So we really want folks to do that. Here are the social media sources. As I said, please really pay attention to these. If there's going to be an event, these are the individuals or the agencies that will have the most accurate information, and it's really, really important that we continue to advocate that with everybody. Whether they are a visitor or resident here in Tuolumne County, we need you to be paying attention to these official web sources. And last but not least, I do have my contact information. We have really tried to expand and do some great things, creating a dedicated web page, creating a dedicated email. We also have an Emergency Operations Center info line that when we do have an event, like we had at the Washington Fire, we will activate that public information line, 533-5151. That is accessible and will be manned by individuals to answer any questions. And the last thing I have is we're going to show you a video that we put together with our partners that are hoping to educate folks here in the community, as well as maybe someone coming to visit. Hi, I'm Dory Beets, Tuolumne County Office of Emergency Services Coordinator. Whether you are a resident or a first-time visitor, we want to share important information about what you can do to be a part of the solution should we ever have an emergency in Tuolumne County.
And I'm Tuolumne County Sheriff Bill Pooley. The first step is to register with our emergency alert system. This will enable us to send a message about evacuation should it be necessary. It is vital that you pre-register and select how you'd like to be notified.
I'm Nick Cashy, Unit Chief for the CAL FIRE Tuolumne Calaveras Unit and Fire Chief for the Tuolumne County Fire Department. The next step is to know the risks and your surroundings. We want to make you aware you have entered an area of extreme fire danger. In 2020, over 4 million acres burned across California. More than 10,000 homes and businesses were damaged or destroyed, and 33 lives were lost. Tuolumne County is no stranger to wildfire. It continues to be the most dangerous threat to lives and the livelihood of the residents and visitors of Tuolumne County. Visit readyforwildfire.org and take the steps in CAL FIRE's Ready, Set, Go to be ready for wildfire.
I'm Jason Kiken, Forest Supervisor for the Stanislaus National Forest. In the Stanislaus National Forest, whether you are here for the day or camping for several days, fire restrictions may be in place in certain areas or across the forest, depending on the conditions and the time of the year. These restrictions may prohibit building, maintaining, attending, or using a campfire or stove. In general, developed recreation sites are exempt, but under certain conditions, even these sites may be restricted. Before you visit the beautiful Stanislaus National Forest, please make sure you check on our website or call our local office for information regarding current restrictions.
As public safety officers, your welfare is our #1 concern. During the summer months, the number of people visiting our county increases while our resources remain the same. Our county is vast. The time to travel from our population center to Yosemite or the Sonora Pass is over an hour, and cell service is limited in this area. That is why it is so important that these safety precautions are heeded.
If you are visiting our county, please know there's only one way in and one way out in many of our areas. Only park in designated parking spaces, never on the side of the roadway. In the event of an emergency, every inch of that area is needed to get visitors out and emergency vehicles in.
If you are asked to evacuate, please do so. Do not wait until it is too late. Pay attention to first responders and tune into local resources for important information.
Safety during an emergency is a community effort. Whether you are a resident or a first-time visitor to our beautiful county, you need to be part of the solution.
Thank you, Dory. We had one question come in for you regarding evacuation routes, which you mentioned, and egress routes. The further part of the question was if the county is going to do anything about maintenance, clearing along the roads. One of the big problems over at the Paradise Fire was there was one way out and there was fire burning on both sides, and a lot of people died in their cars because they couldn't. The fire was right there beside the road. I just wonder if the county has anything that's.
Yeah, I think this is on, yep. We are continually, we have identified projects along county roadways that would be egress routes. We actually put in for funding, but we didn't get it, but maybe we'll get it next time. But we are continuing to look at more funding and dedicate resources to clear those areas, because we understand that that's part of the problem as well. And we want to make sure that we are brushing those potential egress routes.
Sounds great. Mm-hmm. Well, let's give a hand to the panel here. Thank them for coming up. Thank you much. Thanks, Dory. Now we're going to watch a short video. The first 3/4 of this video is on the Paradise Fire, and the last quarter of it is on the Washington Street Fire. I'll warn you up front, if you're a crybaby like me, get your handkerchiefs out, because this is going to touch you. And it's something we face and we need to be ready for. So here we go.
And then there was a point in there where the wind just kind of started picking up. And the spot fires that were not a big deal at the time started engulfing both sides of the road.
By 7:30, the fire had picked up. The wind was spraying burning embers in every direction. A column of smoke was now visible for miles. At the incident command post, Chief Messina was aware this was becoming a major fire.
Just be ready to call in personnel that are off duty right now.
But with firefighters in Concow trapped and aircraft unable to fly because of the wind, he didn't know how fast it was moving.
What was different about this day, it was the fact that as soon as our firefighters engaged, they went right into rescue mode. And they were no longer able, nor did they really care where the fire was spreading. They were too busy on rescuing civilians and ensuring that of their own safety. So we didn't get a lot of intelligence on how fast the fire was spreading.
In the past, fires have rarely crossed the canyon. But the campfire was now spreading at a rate of 80 football fields a minute.
All units, be advised, the town of Paradise is under a mandatory evacuation. The town of Paradise is under a mandatory evacuation.
The fire was swirling around the houses. It was coming in at all angles, defying any sense of gravity or any sense of, in my mind, what would be normal for a fire. Too much was happening, too much was going on, and we were not able to do more than just a couple of handful of streets.
For the moment, yes.
Everybody's here. All the patients are out from downstairs.
You rock.
I don't know about staff, but we got them all out.
Okay, very good.
There was people that were having to carry an IV bag with them, that were holding their own IV bag. And then we had people that were just coming out of surgery that had to be loaded up.
No availability of ambulances to Hood River Hospital. We have fire on campus now, and I need ambulances.
Doctors pulled up with their SUVs and were putting patients in with doctors.
Perfect. Are you helping getting people out of here? Yeah. Okay. Hang a hard right.
And nurses are driving their own private vehicles and taking out their car seats and leaving them on the side of the hospital ground. It wasn't a normal evacuation that we've been planning and rehearsing. It was so fast.
What was that? We got room for one more right here as well.
With anywhere from a few minutes to 15, 20 minutes, everything around the hospital was burning and on fire. It went black real quick. It felt like working a night shift.
Is it safe to stand here like this? I don't know if it's safe anywhere. We're to lose the hospital.
In less than an hour, the fire swept across the town of Paradise, overwhelming the firefighters' efforts to stop it.
And those winds can push those embers a long ways. And it just kind of perpetuates into one big fire at once. There was no flaming front.
But in this fire, winds high up to 100 miles an hour were blowing the embers sideways.
The wind aloft that lofted the embers was a lot stronger wind than the wind at the surface. And that's what allowed it to throw fireballs all over our town.
County F-15, good to open up both lanes and get everybody out. Pearson and Sawmill need to stop all traffic. Planes, get people moving now.
We conceded, I can tell you, it was 9:23 in the morning. We conceded that maintaining the evacuation routes and civilian rescue was our only objective that day.
Cell phone towers went down. The networks were so clogged that we couldn't get through it. It was an event that literally outpaced all of our resources almost immediately, literally outpaced all of the planning that had been done prior to this.
And my car is starting to fill up with smoke at that point. And I told my husband, I'm like, the car's filling up with smoke. I have to get out of the car. And he's like, get out and run. And I'm like, I can't get out and run. You don't understand. There's fire everywhere and I can't run through fire. And he said, you're gonna have to.
Are you trapped?
Yes.
Is your... Okay.
They were coughing, choking. She had a hard time even telling me exactly where they were.
Ma'am, you need to get out of the house.
We can't. Every door's on fire, please.
It started getting real staticky, and I had no response. I was talking to myself, and after 9 minutes and something, the phone went dead.
It took only 4 hours for Paradise to be destroyed. 85 people perished in the campfire. The majority were over 65 years old. Some were trapped in their cars, others were still in their homes.
Everything was perfect that day for a massive destructive incident to do what it did. And it's in place everywhere. Everywhere in California, Arizona, Nevada, Washington, Oregon. And it's like, you don't even want to think about it. Like, what's next? Can it be worse than that? And the answer is yes.
While you're processing what you've just seen, I want you to consider this. What happened in Paradise can happen here. Yeah, it can happen here, and it almost did. It almost happened here on August 26th. And what was the difference? Why didn't Sonora burn to the ground like Paradise? There was one answer: the wind. They had it, and we didn't. In Paradise, not only was the wind pushing flames at incredible speeds and carrying embers far out ahead of the flames and starting spot fires, most people don't know that with high winds like that, we lose complete use of any air attack. No bombers dropping retardant, no helicopters delivering water or retardant, no spotter planes up in the air feeding fire to the ground crews. You heard the chief say that they had no idea what was happening with the fire. There were no planes in the air telling them. All they had was ground crews and ground equipment only. On August 26th, here in Sonora, if there wasn't even a breeze, I've seen pictures taken from a little ways away from the fire, and you can see the column of smoke going straight up. There was zero breeze that day. We were very lucky. And with the Columbia Air Attack Base right out in Columbia, we had also had immediate access to incredible air power. The Arola fire was still going across the river, so aircraft were nearby dumping on it. As soon as the fire bosses saw what was happening and the potential for catastrophic fire in downtown Sonora, they diverted everything they had to the Washington fire. The attack stopped the fire from roaring north over the Signal Hill into Gibbs Ranch and Rancho Sonora Estates, or into Sonora Knolls, which would have run it out towards Columbia. They stopped it burning south into Millville Estates, which was just right across the road, and from racing east over Knolls Hill into downtown Sonora. And yes, along with hand crews on the ground from Bear Valley, they stopped from burning my business down and having the flames run into town via the fairgrounds. Those of you who are familiar with this area, my shop is about a quarter of a mile down here. That's that green building you saw at the beginning. It's actually blue, but at the beginning of that video with those 100-foot flames coming towards it. And if it had gone past there, it would have gone right up Woods Creek, right through behind us up here, and right into Sonora. All it would have taken was some wind. We all saw what the Washington fire did with no wind and tremendous air support. Imagine the results would have been if we'd had wind speeds high enough to ground the aircraft. The fire would have done catastrophic damage to Sonora no matter which way the wind blew it. We could not have stopped it. We need to stop thinking of wildfires as just being up there in the forests. Wildfires, and we need to change our diction from forest fires to wildfires. Wildfires can, and as we've seen with the Washington fire, happen right in our town. We are surrounded by and live in a landscape of incredible potential fire fields that have grown up and choked the open land around our homes and throughout our towns. Will a catastrophe like Paradise happen again? Absolutely. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And it could be worse if we don't prepare. It's hard to imagine how it would change our lives. I have an employee who used to live in Paradise before the Camp Fire. His house burned down, the business he worked in burned down, the bank he deposited his checks in burned down, as well as the grocery store he shopped at, the school his children attended, and the hospital you saw in the picture there where his children were born. His town is gone, and now so is he. He and thousands of others who called Paradise their home have had to start a new life elsewhere. Once again, don't think it can't happen here. People living in Oakland Hills thought it couldn't happen there either. Those of you who are old enough to remember that fire, it wiped a big chunk of Oakland out. Look around us. The Camp Fire took out Paradise. The Butte Fire took out a big chunk of Calaveras County. And look at the damage done north of us this year with the Caldor, the Dixie, and the Bootleg fires, some of the largest in history. And we've still got big fires burning south of us, sending smoke our way. We dodged a bullet with the Rim Fire. It started in a remote area, and even though it got huge, it didn't burn into any of our communities. We all need to remember that Sonora has a history of burning down. We all need to remember, too, that this can happen here. TuCare has been educating about and promoting the wise use of natural resources for over 30 years. The care and management of those resources must include reducing the threat of catastrophic wildfires and the damage they do to our forests, our communities, our business, our homes, and our lives. We will not be fulfilling our mission as TuCare if we don't step up and help our community, our friends, and our neighbors protect the place we call home. TuCare board the TuCare board has recognized that the greatest threat to our community is fire, and we're going to do something about it. Today is one of the many events that TuCare is utilizing to raise money for the Community Wildfire Protection Fund. This project is a combined effort between TuCare, a project advisory board, and the Sonora Area Foundation. TuCare will make presentations like this one today to educate the public about the need to reduce fuels on their own property, work with their neighbors to clean up fuels in their neighborhood, and the need to work community-wide to get fuels reduction projects done. TuCare will help raise the money needed. The advisory board will review and approve projects as they are submitted, and the Sonora Area Foundation will hold and distribute the funds that are raised for projects that are selected. Our goal is to help fund projects that can't be funded any other way. We want to help private landowners be a part of the effort to reduce the threat to our community. There's been some good work done already, and there's some ongoing, but we need much more, much more. We need to make the community aware of the need to get the community behind this effort. Just look around where you live. Gullies choked with fuel, overgrown vacant land, hillsides thick with brush and trees, all ripe for a catastrophic fire. Although I should have known better, I had never considered that hillside full of brush between my shop and the bypass as a threat. Those 100-foot flames you saw in the video proved that different. We are very lucky it didn't burn through our shop. So what's the land around your house look like? Will it be the source of the fire that burns your house to the ground and makes it look like the scenes we saw in the video? Shaded fuel breaks with ground fuels removed must replace the dense vegetation we see all around us. There are some local examples of shaded fuel breaks that have recently been created. Above the hospital in Sonora Plaza, the shopping center, the brush and ladder fuels were removed a year ago. A project is now just being done behind Sonora High that wraps around over to Racetrack Road and that are creating shaded fuel breaks that will enable, one of the things that Adam talked about was the ability to get in there and work. The key word to that is to work safely. One of the reasons we create these shaded fuel breaks is so the forest fire fighters can safely get in and try to save the rest of the land that isn't burning. We need to make that happen. And you can help fund this project and others like it. For those of you who feel led to contribute today, stop by the registration table over here, talk to a TuCare member, and they will help you. You can also make donations directly to Sonora Area Foundation with a notation for the CWPF. Donations for the Community Wildlife Protection Fund, of course, are tax deductible. This is a big job, but if we don't get started, we're never going to get done. Join us. Let's get started now. If you and I are not willing to make the investment to protect our own community, who will? Thank you. And is Daryl Slocum from Sonora Area Foundation. Come up for a moment.
Thank you, Jeff. Good morning, everyone. My name is Daryl Slocum with the Sonora Area Foundation. I hate having to go after that video. Very troubling. I, like you, was impacted by the campfire, possibly in different ways. In my work with the Sonora Area Foundation, I was aware of how the North Valley Community Foundation in Chico was impacted by the campfire because their lives changed that day as well, even though they're actually located in Chico. North Valley Community Foundation, on the day of the fire, they had 7 employees. They now have 16 employees and a full-time attorney on staff. They received donations from all 50 states and from all over the world, totaling over $50 million in support of those impacted by the campfire. While that sounds wonderful that people would come out with that kind of support, wouldn't it be amazing if we rallied that kind of support in advance of a fire to prevent it from happening? So I went up and met with them, learned how their lives changed, and on my way back, I stopped and met with the Butte County Sheriff. Sheriff Pooley helped arrange the introduction. And when I met with him, he wanted to know, again, he saw me because our sheriff called and said, Daryl wants to come and see you. And his question is, why are you here? And I said, because I want you to come to Tuolumne County and talk about what happened with the Butte fire. And you saw him on the video. He's kind of a fiery individual. And he said, if you think I'm going to come there and tell your people that they're going to save everyone if a fire like ours hits in your county, you're wrong. And I said, that's what I want you to come talk about. And he did. He came and spoke to a group of stakeholders and told a riveting story. You could hear a pin drop in the room. But it was necessary. It was necessary to remind us of the importance. So we understand the importance of wildfire protection. We're supporting the Community Wildfire Protection Fund. But in addition to that, we do some other things at Sonora Area Foundation. We are a charitable organization. Our IRS designation is we are a community foundation, and we support the community, primarily by making grants and supporting our nonprofit organizations, but we support them in other ways as well. And just before the pandemic hit, we had announced a new project for us, and it was called the Innovation Challenge. And it was a competition to task our nonprofit organizations with spending some time to think about strategic planning and to think about what they could do if they could do anything. In fact, that was the question we posed to them. What would you do if you could do anything? The competition got delayed several times because of the pandemic, but we finally, at the end of August, wrapped it up, and we received 27 submissions, 27 ideas from nonprofit organizations in Tuolumne County. Well, at the same time we were asking that question, and since the campfire, many of you and many others in the community have been asking another question. How do we prevent a camp-type fire from happening in Tuolumne County? Well, TuCare had already been going to work on that, and they submitted a plan for an idea where a strategically placed, well-engineered fire break is created over the most vulnerable parts of Tuolumne County to minimize the chances of a camp-type fire happening here. Today I'm here to proudly announce that that idea was selected as the #1 idea in the Innovation Challenge, and our board of directors has awarded TuCare $35,000 as a result of that idea to be used as necessary to further this project and awareness of the importance of wildfire protection programs. And we're pleased to announce that award today and thank TuCare for all the work that they do and for submitting that idea. Thank you.
Well, obviously, that's good news. The mind's spinning. What can we do? You know, and we have a plan, and the board will get together, and we will. One of the nice things about working with Sonora Area Foundation is it's not just like here, take the money and go do something with it. There will be communication back and forth to make sure that we're all on the same page and the money gets spent effectively, and we accomplish something for our community. Okay, we have another panel set up now. Adam Freeze, Sherry Brennan, and Susie Coker, would you please come up? You have to come around this end. There's only stairs on this end of the podium. Now, as I said before, Glenn Gaccio was supposed to be a member of this panel, and I'm sure he would love to be here rather than where he's at. But Adam has worked with Glenn on shaded fuel breaks in the past, and he will fill in for him. And you've already heard Adam's bio, so I think we'll just pass on by and let Adam have the podium.
All right. I'm honored to be pinch hitting for Glenn today. He's an amazing guy. He's done a tremendous amount of work for this community. If you look at the map on the screen up here, the Highway 108 Fire Safe Council, or now the Tuolumne Fire Safe Council, has its fingerprints all over every one of those projects, and Glenn has been a key driver. And the service that he's done for this community, I don't think you could even calculate. So it's just an honor for me to highlight this project that this is Glenn's concept for a substantial fuel break, and they call it the North Tuolumne fuel break. It's because it's in the north part of Tuolumne County. So this is a pretty staggering project. You can see it's the blue. When you look on the map there, it's the blue on the map. It's about a 27-mile wide fuel reduction project, 5,000 feet wide, 5,000 feet wide. It's about 17,000 acres. It's strategically located along the South Fork of the Stanislaus River Canyon and the North Fork of the Tuolumne River Canyon. Those are two areas where there's a high risk of fire, and it basically represents the urban interface where most people in Tuolumne County live inside of that. When you look at the communities of Sonora, Twain Harte, Tuolumne, all the communities on the 108 corridor are inside here. So it's strategically located. You guys just saw the video on the Paradise Fire. The conditions that we've been facing, we talked earlier about the fuel buildup over the last 150 years or so. Coupled with that, we've had persistent drought conditions that have made firefighting really tough. You guys probably all remember the Rim Fire in 2013 here had a huge impact on this community. That fire spread 50,000 acres in a 24-hour period. We'd never seen that before. The word unprecedented was thrown around all over the place during that fire. We'd never seen a fire spread that way. You had aircraft pilots reporting the fire sheeting through the timber like the way it does through the grass. Conditions that were just staggering. And again, the word unprecedented was thrown out over and over and over again. Last year with the North Fire in Orville, that fire spread about 200,000 acres in 24 hours. So conditions are extremely tough. So when you look at a fuel break, an area where to concentrate fuel reduction, you can see why Glenn, this was his idea of where a fuel break should be, and it is. It's an excellent spot. So the size of this project is pretty intimidating, and Glenn had a phased approach to tackle it. The first thing he wanted to do was a series of demonstration projects of a 300 to 500 foot wide fuel break, so you get buy-in from the public and agencies as far as pursuing efforts in this area that you see in the blue. Part of that phase is really already done. There's been a tremendous amount of shaded fuel breaks in that area already that paint that picture. So that's encouraging that some of that work's already been done. His second phase was a series of 300-foot fuel breaks that pretty much run that 27-mile corridor. And what's encouraging about that is a lot of that work has been done already as well, largely through efforts of local cooperators in the county, and most of those through the Fire Safe Council. You can see on the map, anything that's red is existing. Anything that's green is proposed, and this map's a little bit outdated. Some of those things that are green on the map, the Ponderosa Miramonte fuel break out of Tuolumne is nearing completion, and then the Mountain Boy Mine out of Columbia that ties from Yankee Hill over to the Big Hill. Work hasn't started yet, but a grant was just received to do that work. So we're well on the way to completing that phase of this, which is huge. There's still a lot of work to do, but it's exciting to see that there's already been progress made. Glenn recognized that a project of this scale is not going to be done by one person or one funding source. So one of the things that he was really counting on was local fundraising, which was talked about just a minute ago. And so I'm excited to see that there is enthusiasm for that. This is the scope of this project is really large, but extremely important. So Glenn and I have had a lot of conversations about this when he first proposed it, and when I first saw it, I went, it's too big. How's the work going to get done, and how's it going to get maintained? So, in ancient times, there was a people that returned to their homeland, and they found it in ruins. They had an army pursuing them, and they had an impossible task of rebuilding the wall around their city before their enemies were upon them. And they got it done by every family did their part. Every family built the wall in their section, and it linked to family to family to family to family until it was complete. And they got it done. They had a will to work, and they were vigilant. And that's what it's going to take to get this done and to keep our community safe. People were prepared, just like Dory talked about, being prepared to evacuate. It's we're in the 11th hour. We dodged a bullet this year, I think. It was nice coming here and seeing it rain today. We've got a short period of time to get a lot of work done before next fire season is going to be. We're not done with this fire season yet, but we have a short period of time to get this work done. And it's going to take everybody working together to get it done. So anyway, I know I apologize. I wish Glenn could be here to talk about this, but that is the Highway 108 North project, or the Tuolumne North project. So thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Yeah, this is quite a project, and it is amazing how much of it is done already. One of the things that Glenn's vision for this is that once we get a 300-foot wide shaded fuel break across that intersection between the Forest Service land and private land, is that will then give the Forest Service confidence to burn out from there, that with much less risk of the fire backing up into the occupied areas. So it's very important, and it's something we need to keep working on. Now we're going to hear from Sherry Brennan. She's going to tell us about the value of grazing in fuels reduction. Let me read Sherry's bio. Sherry Brennan is a member of a multi-generational family cattle operation. She has served as the National Cattlemen's Beef Ambassador Chair, California Farm Bureau's Public Lands Chair, trustee on the Tuolumne County Board of Education, and was our county supervisor for District 1 for several times. Most recently, she's been appointed by the California Secretary of Agriculture to serve on the California Cattle Council. Sherry is a proponent of keeping working landscapes working, both through education programs, legislative advocacy. Sherry holds a BS in animal science from Cal Poly State University, San Luis Obispo.
Thank you, and thank you for giving me this time. Really appreciate it. My presentation is going to be a little dark in the beginning, and I'm going to ask you to bear with me, because after we get through some darkness, we are going to step into some light and some very, very exciting news. And so with that,
everything's been destroyed. I think of the community, I think of the people who've been engaged.
It's so out of control because we've had literally decades of not managing the forest.
We've hurt wildlife diversity, we've hurt soil, plant health, and I'm not saying cows are the solution, I'm saying they can be part of that. Grazing can be a solution, controlled burns can be a solution. People shouldn't think this is a daily got his cows killed problem. This is everyone's issue. There's an opportunity for us to work together.
But I sure wish I'd get some help from the state and the feds to say, we're gonna support you.
I think California's willing to listen. It's not about my cows, it's about the loss of their homes.
Let's not study this for 5 years. Let's find 2 or 3 things that we can do tomorrow.
This could have been any number of, literally hundreds of ranching families in the last 8 years. It actually was our family. It was the Erickson family, and it was the Crook family in the 2013 rim fire. And as Adam said, it was unprecedented at the time. It was recorded as the third largest fire in the state of California. The plume was detected all the way up into Canada. This is part of the devastation that comes along with these fires. But as Dave said, this isn't about our cattle. This isn't about our ranches. This is about all of us at this point. These are photos from the 2020 fire season, which now is the worst recorded in history. Last year, 4.2 million acres burned. 33 people died. Over 10,000 homes and structures were destroyed. EPA estimates that the carbon dioxide from the 2020 California fires were the equivalent of 24 million cars. They sent up plumes of pollutants equaling the output of 29 coal-fired plants. The National Fire Protection Association estimates that the 2020 fires cost $1.5 billion in suppression costs, in insurance costs, in property loss, environmental cleanup, and lost tax revenue. But as staggering as that number is, the EPA is estimating that the short and long-term health impacts associated with the prolonged exposure to the toxic air is going to be a staggering $450 billion. So this really isn't an industry problem. This is a California problem. This is a Western states problem. And now, this is really the exciting part for me, because for some time, I think as ranchers, we have seen the influence of grazing on our private lands. And we've seen the ability to stop a lot of fires and control burns on those private lands because of cattle grazing. But we haven't had the science to back it up. And so the industry is investing in that science. And 2 of the most important studies were just released this year. So this is the first study, and it talked about what are the residual dry matter. How much do you have to get off of the land to be successful in aiding with fire? Can we start this one?
Back in December of 2017, we got a phone call from a rancher over towards Santa Paula, and he said, hey, a fire just started over by St. Thomas Aquinas College. And that fire come down that canyon like a cyclone, spinning from side of the canyon to side of the canyon. 80, 85 mile an hour winds. About that time, the embers started coming. And I mean, it was an ember shower like I've never seen before. Embers the size of your thumb were just flying, landing in the pocket of your coat, lighting your coat pocket on fire. 600 bales of hay on one side of the light caught on fire at once. And we really had a mess going. And for about 10 hours, we stayed there and fought that fire. We never saw anything like that in our whole life, a fire that kind of intensity and that kind of burning. And thank God for the grazing that we did around the house and around the office, because the office is just a half a mile below the house, and we didn't have the resources to fight the fire at the office and the house. But the grazing we did around the office, it saved the office just naturally. 500 houses to the east of that area that hadn't been grazed in 30 years almost completely burned to the ground, that neighborhood, and 500 people lost their homes. Across the rest of the ranch, we managed all the way across the rest of Ventura. Yeah, there were some homes that burned down from embers, but 95% of the homes that burned down were because of the pastures that weren't grazed. And most all the homes adjacent to the pastures that were grazed were saved. So I can't preach anything more to my urban neighbors than the fact that grazings would help protect you. Because without us, this vegetation would have been 4 times as thick and the damage would have been 4 times as bad.
incredibly dramatic, but a solution. We visited, when I was chairing the RCRC Fire Insurance Ad Hoc Committee, we were down in Ventura County right after this fire. We were at the Ronald Reagan Museum, and the fire literally burnt up to the museum, and the curator at the museum credited 100% their ability to save it because of the intensive grazing that they had done on the property. There are approximately 1.8 million beef cattle in the state of California. They graze in every county in the state of California except for the county of San Francisco. In 2017, it's estimated by departments of agriculture that those cattle consumed 11.6 billion pounds of vegetation. So with the study that was just recently released, of course, in different areas of the state, we see different pounds of vegetation that are growing. And in our area, roughly, we hit between 3,000 and 3,200 pounds per acre. And I think we can all say that driving down the road, we see areas that look like this. Whoops. Skipped one, I'm sorry. This is the picture of 3,200 pounds per acre. Through the study, they determined that if we can get down to about 1,400 pounds per acre, the flame length is at that 4-foot length in a 45-mile-an-hour wind. And so we can actually aid in this fire threat if we can get our grazing residue matter down to this 1,400 pounds per acre. And so what has been one of the other objections to using cattle, using any livestock to help with this as a tool in the toolbox for managing our landscapes is the conversation around methane. There have been a number of individuals that have really advocated against using livestock grazing because of the methane that they produce that goes into the atmosphere and its contribution to climate change. And I think this is probably one of the most exciting pieces that has come out, and this paper was actually just published 2 weeks ago, and the professor from UC Davis has already been invited to talk to the World Health Organization because this information is a game changer. So one last short video here.
What if I told you that cattle could be part of a climate solution? That's interesting, right? Well, it's true, and it's because of how methane works. Let me explain. Cattle emit methane, which is a strong greenhouse gas, and we need to make sure we're not emitting more methane. But if we can decrease it, then good things can happen. Methane is a greenhouse gas emitted from various sources. There's fossil fuel extraction, wetlands, and ruminant animals. When we measure methane's impact on the climate, we do so by comparing it to carbon dioxide, which is the most abundant greenhouse gas in our atmosphere. But the way we've been comparing the two climate pollutants doesn't reflect how they warm the planet. And if we're talking about a warming climate, then we should measure greenhouse gases by how they warm, right?
If your question is, how do we reduce warming? Then the answer is yes, we have been looking at methane incorrectly. We want to know what the impact of a methane reduction is on warming. And for that, CO2 equivalence is a totally wrong unit.
Current standards say 1 molecule of methane is as strong as 28 molecules of carbon dioxide over 100 years. And that's true. But methane doesn't live for 100 years. It's a short-lived climate pollutant, staying in our atmosphere for about 10 years before it's destroyed, meaning it's not causing warming for hundreds of years. Carbon dioxide stays in our atmosphere for 1,000 years, building up and continuing to warm long after it's emitted. Methane from cattle is also part of the biogenic carbon cycle, which has been around since life began. As part of photosynthesis, plants capture carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. absorbing the carbon and releasing the oxygen. That carbon is converted into carbohydrates in the plant, which is then consumed by a cow where it's digested and released from the cow as methane. After 10 years in the atmosphere, that methane is broken down and converted back into carbon dioxide. These carbon molecules are the same carbon molecules that were in the plant the animal ate, which was pulled from the atmosphere by the plant and is now back in the atmosphere. It's recycled carbon.
Biogenic carbon is different because it's going through a cycle. That's very different from fossil carbon, which goes through a one-way street from the bottom up into the air. If we were to keep our herd size constant, then that would mean that the amount of methane produced by our livestock and the amount of methane destroyed balancing each other out, meaning no additional carbon added to the atmosphere, and that means no additional warming.
Methane from cattle is considered a flow gas because as it is emitted, it is destroyed. Conversely, carbon dioxide from fossil fuels is a stock gas, which means it's stockpiling, or in other words, building up in the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide emitted today is added to the carbon dioxide emitted yesterday, which was added to the carbon dioxide the day before, and so on. This isn't a cycle, it's a one-way source of warming. The good news is, if we manage to reduce methane from cattle, such as with feed additives or digesters, we can actually generate short-term cooling. This is significant as we try to keep global temperatures from rising past 1.5 degrees Celsius.
What gets me the most excited is that if we reduce methane from, let's say, cattle, then we are actively pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. That's almost as if you were to store atmospheric CO2 in the ground. If you reduce methane from cattle, you pull carbon out of the atmosphere, and that induces global cooling. Can it be done? It can be done, and it has been done. Here in California, for example, we have been able to reduce methane by 25%. The way we reduce this 25% methane in California is through manure management changes. If you reduce methane, you induce a strong cooling effect. So meaning cattle being an important part of the solution to reduce our overall impact on climate.
Rethinking methane allows us to focus on climate solutions, both in the short term and long term, while still working to feed a growing population. But it'll take farmers and ranchers, regulators, and researchers working together to do so.
This study is a game changer. I'm getting the 1 minute marker, and so I'm going to wrap it up. I'm just very excited that we now have the science that's going to say that cattle grazing is a tool. It's going to be a very important tool in the toolbox, and I'm looking forward to working with all of the different land jurisdictions and owners to ensure that we utilize grazing as part of that tool. Thank you.
Thank you, Sherry. Yeah, when you clear around your house, let's check and see if you can fence that and put a few cows on it. Serious. I mean, because as we've heard, if any of these clearing jobs we do, 5-7 years from now, you've got to go back and do it again. The cows can minimize that. They can reduce, get the grass out, get the brush out. It can be a win-win, and you get to eat them too. Our next speaker is Susie Coker. She's going to talk to us about prescribed burning and all the latest developments there. Susie Coker is an extension forester for the University of California Cooperative Extension in the Central Sierra region of California. She advises forest landowners on property management for wildfire resilience. She currently has 2 major initiatives going. One, helping landowners, being a landlord, that comes off my tongue easy, helping landowners develop forest management plans to reduce fuels and teaching them how to conduct prescribed burns on their property. Susie is a member of the California Governor's Wildfire Resilience Task Force. She holds a BA in anthropology and an MS in forest management. She is a California registered professional forester. I think she's got it covered. Susie?
Good morning. Thanks for having me. I was asked to just talk to prescribed fire as at the large landscape scale. So I'm going to include some examples of that as well as the smaller scale. So first of all, prescribed fire is an important forest management tool. And when we use the term, we mean usually both burning piles and then throwing fire across the landscape and broadcast burning. And what we mean by prescription is that a fire is ignited under a very specific weather condition. So we're not talking about somebody who lights a fire in August. We're talking about usually in the Sierra after a couple of rains. Winter burns have also been quite successful. And we're talking about very low severity burns. So that's a picture that's very common in a forested area. We know, as Adam showed some great pictures, that Sierra forests are adapted to frequent low severity fire. And so fire is both a management tool and an integral ecological process. There are a lot of things we think in scientific circles that fire has been doing, and we don't even know all the things that would have been happening in our ecosystem with regular fire. But people now can use it to reduce fuel, control invasive species, improve your forage, restore your meadows, and also there's a whole suite of purposes for cultural use by encouraging culturally important plants to native tribes or other things. So oftentimes cultural burning is described as its own process as opposed to prescribed fire because it does have very specific objectives. And Adam talked a lot about fire regime. I just wanted to show you this picture of a fire scar in a tree. So this tree was burned by low severity fires, and each one of those little marks and years is the scar that the tree experienced and then healed over. So you can see it continued to heal over until the tree died in 1897. So we have very good data in forested systems about how common fire used to be. A lot less so in shrub systems or grasslands, but with trees we have really good data. So this would be considered a frequent fire regime, and if you took the gaps in between those years, 1897 to 1889, there's 8 years. From the one before, there's 6 years, and you average it, you get yourself what's called a fire return interval. And I'm forwarding, and I'm having no luck. Pushing my forward button. Should I push it some? Okay, thank you. So the fire return interval, here's a map of the Sierra Nevada, and it's colors, and it's kind of small, but the darkest browns there are every 11 years. So the data shows that in most of those forested conifer forest regions, between 5 and 12 years, mixed conifer 8 to 20 years. And a lot of this fire was lightning generated in the Sierra Nevada, but also cultural fires, so native management. These are a couple of good books you can read if you want to know a lot about it. They're really great to read. On the coast, there's very little lightning, and there's still quite a bit of fire data and obvious burn periods. So we could say that that was almost a completely human-caused fire regime over there. But we think that before fire suppression, between 4 and 12 million acres of California burned every year, so 5 to 12%, but not with the impacts that we're seeing today. Mostly low severity fire, patches of high severity fire where all the trees are killed, but definitely not having the impacts that we're seeing today because of the fuels. Okay, so I just wanted to give you a quick background on fire suppression and policies around prescribed fire. So the Forest Service really got started with fire suppression around 1905. 1910 was a really bad year when a lot of policies were changed. The big blow up in Montana and Idaho, and after that, it was a policy of full suppression everywhere. except in California. California resisted for some period of time because there were still people who understood the use of prescribed fire, native folks, ranchers, some of the early settlers. So it was called light burning, and there was a controversy and arguments in newspapers. Red River Lumber Company, which is up in Lassen County, continued to burn and use prescribed fire in their timberlands until it was outlawed in 1924. So the Forest Service took the lead and said that light burning was ineffective, impractical, and economically indefensible. And then California State Board of Forestry adopted the policy as well at the same year. However, by 1943, in other parts of the US where the Forest Service was managing landscapes, people really started to complain and fight back. And in the Southeast, it was because of a lot of brush encroachment in the longleaf pine areas. So they started to get much fewer of the wildlife species that they were interested in there. And the poster child of prescribed fire in the Southeast is the bobwhite quail. So the hunters and all those folks said, you have to let us burn because we're getting all this brush encroachment and we're not getting the game that we're looking for. So in 1943, there was an exception in the Southeast. In California, 1945 was actually the year when CAL FIRE started to allow permits to do prescribed burning with the ranching community. We had about 200,000 acres burned on private land by 1955. And I have a picture there of Dr. Harold Billswell, who came from the Southeast, where he'd worked in longleaf pine areas, and was a professor of forestry at UC Berkeley, and was very interested in burning. He faced a lot of pushback and strong headwinds, but he did work with ranchers, he worked with forest landowners, and helped through his students to really change the actual attitudes to prescribed fire in California. So by the 1970s, prescribed fire was becoming more common on public lands, but still really there was very little done since the 1950s on private lands. So what do we need to start scaling up burning? On public lands, I would say we need larger scale and more frequent burns. And on private lands, there are larger ownerships that are currently burning, for example, Southern California Edison. And then there's many smaller lands where there are opportunities for burning. Okay, so since I was asked to address large-scale prescribed burning, there hasn't really been that much in the Sierra Nevada. But the Caples Creek Restoration Project was conducted by the Forest Service on the El Dorado National Forest. And so I wasn't, obviously that's not my burn since I don't work for the Forest Service, but later there's a link to a 2-hour webinar on this burn and all the issues and how it was produced. I'm just giving you a little few highlights. These were the goals: to improve watershed health, hazardous fuel accumulation, and public safety, improve public safety. And so those hashed lines are the areas that were to be burned. The project had proposed 8,800 acres of burning, and it's a long, narrow watershed in a roadless area. So there's not mechanical methods necessarily that could be used to reduce fuels in that area. And it goes from a lower elevation to a higher elevation where there's a lot of granite. They put in a 50-foot wide fuel break along the northern ridge, and then volunteers came in and raked around some of the oldest trees, some around 300 years old. And there's the link to the webinar if you're interested in watching it. And you've probably heard of it because it escaped. So it was lit in September 30th, and they had 1,000 acres burn and then realized that they couldn't control it, and they called in additional resources to help control it. And it got to 3,400 acres. That's a burn severity map there, with a red being high severity fire. So it did not come out as well as they hoped, but if you compare it to wildfires in the area, it's not far from the King Fire, and the amount of high severity fire was much lower where all the trees were killed. And in their after action review, they identified some mistakes that they made when they lit the piles. So they started with piles, and it was snow on the ground, and then they had some high wind drying events. They found out that they had mismeasured fuel moisture. They brought in a number of different crews. They couldn't have crews there. They had hotshot crews that were obligated to go elsewhere. And they were using grant funds through the Sierra Nevada Conservancy and were being very careful on the use of those grant funds. Once they declared it a wildfire, that meant they got all the resources they needed. And I just think you should contemplate that point, because I found that incredibly ironic, right? So they had to get a grant to do a prescribed fire to avoid a wildfire, but once it was a wildfire, then they could get all the resources they needed. And so hotshot crews came in and they got it under control, right? So I can't help but wonder if they had all the resources they needed to implement the prescribed fire, the better outcomes that they would have seen. So I think, though, that we can say that it increased public safety as its objective. So I live in South Lake Tahoe. I was evacuated for 2 weeks from the Caldor fire, and that's a picture of the Caldor fire that's still actively burning. So I don't know if I have a pointer. Oh, I do have a pointer. Okay, so right here is Christmas Valley, and I live about right there. But you can notice in the Caldor fire, there's a very interesting shape. That's what that is. That's the Caples prescribed burn right there. And for quite a while, it held a line. It just burned up to it. And then as the fire wore on and the wind blew, it went around like this. And it has recently blown up a little bit, and it's burned across. For a while, they were calling it the gator's maw because it looked like the mouth of an alligator. But now this is filled in. So I guess, there was a lot of criticism of how this fire went by some of the partner agencies, but I think in retrospect, if you've watched how the Caldor fire burns, you can only say that this was really quite successful. And there should be more. Okay, so that's the kind of prescribed fire at large scale that's been done so far by the Forest Service. So I want to talk about prescribed fire on private lands. So if you look at this map, it's a map of the eastern part of the US and a land ownership map. If you look at the state of Florida there, it's almost all in white, which means it's almost all private land. And yet, Florida is the orange line here. Here's how many prescribed fire acres they did in 2017, over 2.5 million, compared to wildfire acres, compared to our kind of very small amount of prescribed fire. So it's clearly possible to do large-scale burning on private lands because it's done in the Southeast and also in the Midwest, and it just hasn't been done here, not for the last 100 years, but it was before. Okay, so who is doing burning on private lands? So there are larger landowners that are involved in that. So this is a photo from the Southern California Edison down in Shaver Lakes. They have timberlands. They're primarily an energy company, so they don't rely on timber for all their income, but they do sell timber, and they burn in between their trees, and they also use it as a fuels reduction tool. So these are photos this is a photo I took on the SAF field trip just last month. If you look at that map, that's where we're standing, and the blue hash marks are a prescribed burn unit, all right there, that they've been filling in. They do most of their burning themselves with a pretty small crew, and then they also work with CAL FIRE through their vegetation management program. And so they do their own burning on the less complex units where it's not that difficult for them to do themselves, and then CAL FIRE has been coming in as a partner and burning more complicated units with very steep slopes and heavy brush. And the folks there credit a lot of this work with helping to save Shaver Lake from the creek fire. So it's been really an important component. The picture down here is of a workshop I got to hold with Southern California Edison. We had 38 people out there, all of us completely unqualified. And we burned 5 acres in a day with heavy fuels. And it was super fun, and that's what we're celebrating right there. So, small private landscapes can also add up. So one of my initiatives in the last 3 years has been helping teach people how to do prescribed burns on their own lands. We've been through 15 workshops so far, and we've had about 500 landowners trained. This is of a burn up in Placer County. And as part of that, we have, so since I can finish that thought, thank you. There are a number of people who are doing burning on their own lands. This is Alan Edwards. He owns a tree farm in Placer County. We're going back in November, and we're doing another workshop with him. And so more and more people are feeling comfortable enough to take that step to do their own burning. And there are a few people who have never stopped. So I would just also try and describe that there is sort of a movement right now towards this, burning on our own land and developing prescribed burn associations. So these are common organizations in the Midwest and in the South where neighbors help neighbors to burn on their property. And the first one here in California was started in 2017. We now have a number of them across the state. And they're all locally, totally local organizations with their own set of capacities. And here we are. Awesome. We just had a small group. Some of you are in the room who we've met about 4 times now. And I'm happy to tell you we finally chose a name with the steering committee this week, which is the Motherlode Prescribed Burn Association. And our goal really is to grow the knowledge on how to burn, because we recognize that a lot of knowledge has been lost. But we started off at Columbia College, where they've been doing burning, and we're going to be visiting other people's property to talk about burn prep moving forward. And so if you're interested in that, I suggest that you contact me, since I'm currently the organizer. We are hoping to somehow apply for funding, probably through the RCD, to get a coordinator who could actually help stage and prep properties, because that's a lot of work, and all of us right now have other full-time jobs. But I think with a little bit of capacity, we could start to really enable and empower people to do their own burning. And then I just wanted to end with the new prescribed fire policies that were signed at the state level. And this was just within the last 2 weeks. So SB 332, I think, was signed 2 days ago. And some of these policies are going to help increase the capacity for prescribed fire. So SB 332 is a bill that was signed that makes a gross negligence standard in California. So as I understand it, not a lawyer, but there's strict negligence, which means it doesn't matter how hard you tried. If you screwed up, you're liable. There's simple negligence, which sort of means if you screw up, you probably have a chance in court, but you got to go to court. And gross negligence means if you screw up, but you did everything right, and there was a wind event or something like that, then you cannot be held liable for the costs of fire suppression, right? So right now, one of the biggest costs is, yes, you could burn someone's house down. That very rarely happens, but if you lose control of a prescribed fire and CAL FIRE is brought in, then they could reclaim those costs from you. Now they can only do it if you were grossly negligent and you didn't have a plan or you did some really dumb thing. Okay, so I think this is a huge step forward for people, because they'll be able to feel more comfortable that they're not going to sign up to pay for all those helicopters if something goes a little bit wrong. AB 642 actually requires the state to develop a proposal to develop a prescribed burn training center in California, which we don't currently have. We do have a new program where now the state can certify you to be a burn boss, which is very helpful. In the past, we only had national qualifications, which are very hard to get and require fire suppression experience. Current state certified burn boss would not require that you are a firefighter, but that you have lots of experience with prescribed burn, and that would put a lot more people into that category. There'll have to be a cultural burning liaison at CAL FIRE, and there's ways to try and keep their fuels crews employed and doing more fuels reduction. And then the other exciting thing was that there is a prescribed fire claims fund. Insurance is very difficult to get for this activity, and so they're starting it off with a $20 million appropriation so that there'll be some sort of insurance or coverage for liability. Okay, that's it. Yeah.
Well, thank you. That's some really good information. Let's light it off. And this panel is completed now, so if we have any questions that have been turned in. I didn't turn it in because I didn't know where to get the paper. You're the exception, and we're going to allow Rocky, nobody else. Go ahead.
So air quality, my understanding with prescribed burns, a huge problem is getting the right moment, the right air quality permission. How are we going to deal with that? Because that has been a problem in the past.
It has air quality. Can you hear me? Okay. Yes, so to burn, you need a air quality permit or a burn day every day of the year. In the winter, you don't need a CAL FIRE permit, but during burn season, you also need a CAL FIRE permit. So those are the two permits that you're required to have. Most of our local air quality districts are really working hard to help people do more prescribed fire. They've been very active in prescribed burn associations, and Tuolumne counties and Calaveras counties, their coordinators came to our PBA meeting and they pledged to work closely with people who want to do more burning. So I think that was true in the past, but I don't think it's a huge constraint at this point. I see burning in season, getting your CAL FIRE permit is a little bit more difficult than that, or burning out of season, just having the knowledge and experience to feel comfortable doing it as a big barrier.
If I can just echo on that, I don't know if you can hear me all right. Yeah, I've heard that as people bring that up in the past a lot about, hey, we can't burn because they're too much trouble working with air quality, and I've been at this a long time. That's never been the case locally in Tuolumne and Calaveras counties. They've been working with those guys has been outstanding. They're huge supporters of prescribed burning and great to work with. So
that's real good news. All right, well, thank you. Let's give them a round of applause. All righty, our next speaker is retired CAL FIRE Chief Ken Pimlott, who's going to be discussing what must change. Ken, where are you? There you are. Okay. Chief Pimlott began his fire service career in 1984 as a reserve firefighter in Contra Costa County, California. He joined CAL FIRE in 1987 as a seasonal firefighter and ultimately worked his way up through the ranks to director. He knows it all. A position he held from 2010 until his retirement in 2018. Chief Pimlott has a Bachelor's of Science degree in Forest Resource Management from Humboldt State University and is a registered professional forester in California. Under his leadership, CAL FIRE and the state of California battled historic wildfires and an unprecedented bark beetle epidemic, while at the same time increasing the pace and scale of forest management and fire prevention. Chief Pimlott participated in numerous committees at the state and national level and testified before Congress on multiple occasions in support of legislation related to forest management and fire protection, including the federal fire funding fix. Here's a tongue twister for you. Ken, come on
up. Well, good morning, and thank you. So
A couple of things I want to share, and first and foremost is that it's nice to come back home. I've spent a lot of time in my career in Tuolumne County, and you should absolutely take credit. I listened to numerous presentations this morning, and Patrick talked about the formation of the Forest Resilience Task Force in Sacramento, that it had its roots in the Tree Mortality Task Force in response to the over 150 million trees that succumb to the epidemic levels of bark beetle. Well, that started because of grassroots efforts by Tuolumne County. Sherry Brennan, Randy Hanfield, when they were both on the board, and many others joined together with several other motherlode counties and came to Sacramento to make the pitch that we have a problem. And it was this local grassroots effort that brought forward this collaborative approach that has now evolved into a statewide effort to look at the challenges of forest resilience and how we get there. So that's absolutely something to take credit for here locally. I also want to point out, and it wasn't mentioned, about Glenn Gottschall, but for folks that don't know, Glenn was in Sacramento Tuesday evening at the State Fire Safe Council workshop to receive an award on behalf of Tuolumne County for all the efforts that have gone on here, particularly with the fuel break that Adam talked about. Glenn received the first ever Bruce Turbyville Award for leadership, and it was unfortunately shortly after that that he fell ill with this health issue and had to be transported from the workshop. Glad to hear he's doing better, but understand he was there representing Tuolumne County and the efforts you're all doing, and clearly very proud of all of that. So I've learned a lot. I've learned more about what I don't know over the last 35 years than what I know. But clearly today you've heard a lot, and a lot of us are saying the same things. And I'm not necessarily going to say anything different, but I just really want to challenge us as we move forward as to what must change. If we're going to get the things done that we need to do, we've got to look at things bigger, and we've got to look at things a bit different. Some of these statistics you've seen, some may be a little different, but at the end of the day, I think it's important to set the stage. Recently saw in the San Jose Mercury News, 1 out of every 8 acres in California has burned in the last 10 years. It was a different way to look at it, but when you realize that in the last 10 years, we burned almost 13 million acres, predominantly in the last several years. Adam talked about the extreme fire growth on the Rim Fire, North Fire, and several others. No different this year with the Dixie Fire, 100,000 acres in one day. A fire that reached almost 1 million acres and burned for almost 2 months. At the current pace that we're going forward, our forest lands are going to continue to burn at a pace that over the next 20 years, we may have lost the predominant amount of forest land in California, or will all have been succumbed to some level of fire, much of which is at extreme rates. It's converting our forests to shrubs and brush and only perpetuating this extreme fire cycle and this mega fire cycle that we're seeing. And again, 173 lives lost in the last 10 years, and over 43,000 buildings have been destroyed. We talk about suppression costs all the time. Here's what it costs to put, this is how much we spent this year in fighting fire. What we're not sharing enough of is 2018, almost $149 billion impacted in the state. Fire suppression costs pale by comparison to the economic loss, $32 billion alone in public health impacts across the state. Not to mention the untold costs with economic loss in tourism, all of the other issues that come with a disaster to the scale that we're seeing. Smoke exposure, even at minimum levels, can significantly, for example, increase the risk of preterm birth. Other health problems, even conditions that ultimately could lead to increase in fatalities related to wildland fire. This is proving to all of us that clearly it's way beyond just focusing on those of us engaged in the forest and fire sector. This is a Western United States problem in every sector. Smoke. I think smoke is the story of this fire season. Many urban areas in California, of course, have seen dramatic increase in the number of smoke days. San Jose was up 400% this year. Los Angeles up 230%. So the urban areas, many of whom may never have even been to a national forest or been to our forested landscapes in California, are directly bearing the impact of smoke. So what must we do? What must change to change this paradigm? We've heard a lot today about we know what to do. The challenge is we're not treating it like the emergency that it is. And I heard it just a bit ago, and it's spot on. We have no problem, we don't blink an eye responding and putting resources to the suppression effort, which we clearly need to do. We're protecting communities, we're protecting values at risk. But when it comes to investing in all the things we're talking about today, that pales by comparison. We're not doing it. We literally need to put this, I can't describe it for any other term than a war footing. When the pandemic hit the United States, we retooled across the country. We had Ford building respirators for hospitals. People are dying from wildland fires, both directly and indirectly. Billions of dollars in economic losses. We're not treating it like the emergency that it truly is. Once fires go away, we get some rain in the air, we're no longer the front page story. The media is more interested in Facebook, being out for 6 hours. They've completely forgotten that we've burned down whole communities this year. People have lost livelihoods, we've lost valuable timber resources, we've lost habitat. That's all forgotten because we've moved on to other things because it's all good now, because it's raining. We have a plan. Patrick talked about the Forest Resilience Plan. A lot of smart folks, many in this room, have put together efforts to identify where we need to go. But our strategy to implement it is fragmented. Oftentimes it's called random acts of conservation, and it's bogged down in process. Again, you heard conversations about how do we get money out there on a sustained basis rather than every year folks are applying for grants to try to keep their community chipping programs going, to try to put together fuel break projects, all things that require long-term investment and require long-term maintenance, but yet folks are having to go year to year to try to find the funding and may or may not happen. You've heard this too, we lack the workforce. Lots of reasons for that. We're scaling up money. The Californians investing over $1 billion in forest resilience. So we're pushing more money out to communities, out to cooperators. But the money's going to start backing up behind the dams, and the dams are the fact that we don't have the full spectrum of workforce to get it done. We've lost our ability to, we don't have woods workers. We don't have folks that can, as Susan talked about, that are the practitioners that can carry out prescribed burns, that can do environmental review and clearance. Our capacity now is our limiting factor to engage to the level we need to engage and that we are starting to gain funding to accomplish. We also need to focus on the larger scale regional efforts. Go big, go bold, biggest bang for the buck. Let's consolidate efforts and treat hundreds of thousands of acres, not tens of hundreds of acres, and we need to find a way to work through that. Our regulatory ability, we've talked about it, you've heard about it today. NEPA, CEQA, historic preservation laws, all of those were written and enacted at a time when we weren't thinking about carbon sequestration and greenhouse gas emission, megafires. All of those were exceptions to the rule 40, 50 years ago. Things have changed over time, and we need to continue to take a hard look and stand up and be willing to make some difficult decisions about how we work through some of these projects, find efficiencies to work through these programs, or we will never be able to implement projects at scale. What's important to me is this speaking for one voice. We need the collective body to get together and continue to be the voice. Right now, what you're seeing, folks like Chad Hansen, folks I consider to be self-proclaimed pundits on environmental issues, are getting airtime in the LA Times, while the rest of us, the mainstream scientists, the practitioners, everyone who's in agreement that we know what needs to get done, aren't being heard, and we're being drowned out by folks who say the best thing to do in our forests is to do nothing. And that's what our voters in Los Angeles, our large metropolitan areas, are hearing because they don't understand, haven't been out here. These are challenging, difficult issues. We have to continue to band together and be a strong voice, drown out those that are wrong, and say what's right together, and show that we're together on these issues, not fragmented, not pointing fingers back and forth at each other. So fuels management is effective. It's really the only real tool of change. I think Adam talked about it. You know, we can't change the weather, and we don't have enough bulldozers to level the mountains. So at the end of the day, fuels treatment of all types, absolutely reintroduction of fire on the landscape. Much of that landscape is going to require the mechanical treatment to do that. It's okay to talk about logging. That shouldn't be a bad word. All of this is part of the using all the tools in the toolbox to increase the pace and scale across all of the landscape. But we need long-term, dedicated commitment. If we can spend $5 billion in 2020 on fire suppression alone in California, we need to match that with long-term commitment, not budgets that live from year to year, on $5 billion, so we can truly put projects in place that companies are willing to invest in infrastructure, communities can build a workforce. This has to be a long-term commitment, not just one-offs to get us from year to year, or we will never build the capacity back. We will never have biomass plants. We will never have processing facilities, sawmills. We won't have that because no one wants to make an investment if they don't see the commitment long-term. It's going to take all of us continuing to educate our elected officials, our public, our communities, our policymakers, that this is a crisis, it is an emergency, and we need to treat it as that. We talked about investing in programs and a diversified workforce. We need people, again, in every aspect of this. And again, it's not just in the forest sector, it's every aspect. It's our air quality specialists who help monitor air quality to help us articulate to the broader population what the risks are and how we can fix that. Literally down to truck drivers. You can't haul chips, you can't haul logs, you can't move material because we don't have anybody to drive trucks. We are literally at a point where every sector is being impacted. But it's also the responsibility of everybody in all of our communities. We need 100% compliance in defensible space. That's the one thing we can do, and every person living in the urban interface can do, is get that done. And we need the programs, of course, to help them get that done where they can't do it physically. But at the end of the day, we have to show that our communities are doing their part. We also need to be looking at our measures of success. They aren't always just in acres treated. How many facilities have we opened? How many public health changes have we made in terms of improving air quality and reducing health effects generated by smoke? We need to find the metrics that resonate with people across the board in our communities so that when they're making decisions, kids growing up now understanding where this is coming from. And you may not understand what a tree does, but you understand where the smoke's coming from and what we need to do to fix that. So we have to find better ways to communicate with our population. And this isn't not a one and done, this is ongoing every day throughout the year, or we're not going to make the accomplishments that we need to make. Fire prevention, fuels treatment ought to be number one on our radar every day of the week. We need to find ways to get bigger collaboratives, get back together, work on these projects, show successes, and move that around the state. But at the end of the day, it's going to take commitment. It's going to making hard decisions, and it's going to be engaging in hard policy discussions. It's going to continue to take legislation, both at the state and federal level, to make the changes that are needed. If we don't find efficiencies in all of these processes, if we don't find common ground, and we allow groups like the Center for Biological Diversity to continue to put chalk blocks in good projects that are sound projects, and we provide support to our administrators who are trying to do the right thing out on the ground, we're never going to get there. So it's time to stand up and be bold, stand behind our projects, advocate for them, and move forward, and not be afraid to talk about it. Because at the end of the day, fires will impact all of California. Again, we're on a trajectory to burn our forest land in the next 20 years. We've got to have a plan to address every acre. And unfortunately, we're way behind the power curve, as we know. So we will experience, California has it, we have led in everything, sometimes painfully leading the way. But if we don't do it, we're not going to get there. We have the tenacity, we have the experience, we have the knowledge, we have the experts. Now we just need the will of the population and the decision makers to continue to support and move this to a scale that will make a difference. Thank you.
Wow, that's great. Good thing news is that Chief Pimlott has retired, but he's still available as a consultant. So he will be using that knowledge and information he just shared with us throughout the rest of his life, I'm sure. We have done so great on time, and our next two presenters are going to be via Zoom, so we're going to take a break right now. If I can have your attention for a second, just stay where you are, don't get back to your seats or anything, but we've had a couple of questions come in, so we're going to have Adam Freeze come up and address one of them, and then Dory Beats will address the other one. So just hang in there.
All right, so the question was asked, who's paying to manage BLM land throughout Tuolumne County? So BLM is the Bureau of Land Management. It's a federal agency through the Department of Interior. And who's paying for it it's taxpayers are paying for it. It's the federal government. So they're, that Motherlode office is run out of Folsom, and Jerry Martinez is the contact, but they cover a large area from Folsom clear down south, I think, to Bakersfield. So they're spread pretty thin. But that's who to contact for BLM, and that's how that works. I don't know, has that answered the question? All right.
We got another question, and we think Dory's probably the most one qualified to answer it, but we need to give her a little time to read it, so.
I know, I don't have my glasses, so. I was trying to look at it. Let's see if I can get this question. Oh, my glasses. Left them at the table. Dean Alley, this question, in 2020, CAL FIRE, so maybe it's a joint Adam. CAL FIRE awarded Tuolumne County $1.7 million grant for roadway clearance, and our low-income property owners with aid and defensible space. Where were those funds primarily focused, and why were we providing defensible space for homes that were Airbnbs, et cetera? So that's a good question. Adam, I'd have to come up because that was definitely prior to me. I just started in December, but we have done defensible space, and we are still working on a few funding for defensible space that was granted and identified for low-income properties within the county. I am not aware of any Airbnbs or businesses. And so what could have happened primarily is that when these were first identified, when it was awarded, because this is a couple years now, those homes might have turned into an Airbnb after the fact, but they were not. I don't know that. We did identify through a application process with those areas and priorities. And Adam, happy to have you fill in a little bit about that. But I'm not familiar with any of the funding that was dedicated just for businesses or Airbnbs. It was low-income private residences, as far as I'm aware of. Okay. Did you want to add to? You were here, I wasn't.
Yeah, that's correct. So that grant was in Tuolumne County, was awarded to the county, and the defensible space portion was managed by the Fire Safe Council. It was for low income and elderly people. I think they were real close to the Area 12 on aging. And then so half of the grant was for defensible space, half the grant was for roadside brushing, focusing mostly on major collector roads in the county. And yeah, was not for businesses or Airbnbs. It's for low income and elderly. So, all right.
Okay, so we got a question. Can you talk more about cultural burning and how different is it from prescribed burns? I think I tried to frame prescribed fire as a tool with many objectives. And so I think most people that I work with in forested settings really are looking for forest fuels reduction work to be done and burning piles and that sort of thing. That can have some benefits for wildfire issues. It may also stimulate plants that need smoke or fire to germinate. So it is definitely an ecological process that we know helps for forest health. So I think you can accomplish a lot of things with prescribed burning for fuels reduction, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily what cultural burning would be trying to do. So that's why I asked Dory to talk about that.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, cultural burning is a lower intensity. And a little more about my background. Both my grandparents were Miwok. My grandfather was born within the Yosemite National Park boundaries. He's Southern Miwok. And my grandmother was Calaveras, Redwood Flat area Miwok. So I got two sides there. My grandfather was a choker setter, though. He was a logger. That's what he retired out at. So that's what I grew up. I'm an early bird. I get up at 4:30 every morning because of that. But in the cultural burning, what is interesting and what we start to see be revived is that as Native Americans, we obviously have a continued relationship with the land, and a lot of that was in both preservation and never taking as much as we need, only taking what we need, not more than that, and making sure we're continually restoring that. And cultural burning was a way to do that. And there's a lot of data that's out there, and we were doing it for thousands and thousands of years. And it was really managing the forest and managing those areas. But the cultural side of it was related to those types of materials that we needed. I come from a long line of basket weavers, and there are materials that are out there that need to be culturally burned in order to regrow in a certain way, in a healthy way. And so there was a lot of that was going on. There are many tribes for many years that were not allowed to do cultural burning, and now we start to see a lot of our tribal communities. You see the Yuroks and the Kruks, who are definitely leading that way and are doing a lot more organized cultural burning as part of prescribed fire burning as well. Demonstration projects. I know my tribe, Tuolumne Band of Miwok, and our fuels crew was looking at doing a project over in Mariposa. And so there's a lot of opportunity to revitalize that, but it is the lower intensity side of it that could be added with a prescribed fire. And a lot more tribal and indigenous cultures who are supporting that. And so I always say to any organization, whether it's federal, local, state, or even private organizations that are looking, join that in with that local tribal community, because they could give you a lot of support, possibly into both approvals of that, but also that they support those types of activities on their land, their former land, or they're joining lands to tribal communities here. So
might just add real quickly, I had Chairman Ron Good talk at our Shaver Lake workshop from the North Fork Mono, and he has a video online. If you look him up, Ron Good, Goode, and cultural burning. There's a whole series on cultural burning, and he hosts workshops to help people learn how to do it. There's a number of UC Davis students who have done it. Our workshops were canceled because of COVID, but he was encouraging sourberry, and so it was a lot of like cutting the brush, piling, and burning it right there, and then treating the landscape so that sourberry came back very nicely. So it was a lot more specifically oriented to specific plants than just fuels reduction in general.
I just want to say one last thing. CAL FIRE has a Native American Advisory Committee. I actually sit on that, and it's something that we are trying to continually work on, incorporating some of those values to California projects. So.
Well, thank you guys for answering those questions. We are about to get back on schedule. We have the privilege next of hearing the U.S. Forest Service's perspective from the horse's mouth. Believe me, we have two speakers, and we'll be hearing via Zoom or something similar to Zoom. They will be Randy Moore, who is Chief of the U.S. Forest Service, and Jennifer Eberlein, who is the Region 5 Forester. We've got Randy up first, so I will read his bio. Randy Moore is Chief of the United States Department of Agriculture. We're talking big thing here, folks. This is the big guy. Leading a workforce of more than 25,000 permanent employees who sustainably manage 193 million acres of national forests and grasslands. They support one of the world's largest forestry research organization, work with states, tribes, and others to sustain all of America's forests for the benefit of all citizens today and into the future. Before being named Chief of the U.S. Forest Service, Moore served as Pacific Southwest Regional Forester from 2007 to 2021, where he was responsible for 18 national forests in California, covering 1/5 of the state of California, 20 million acres of land. He also oversaw, and this was interesting, state and private forestry programs in Hawaii and all U.S. affiliated islands. Who knew? Moore began his 43-year career in 1978 with the USDA's National Resource Conservation Service in North Dakota. He began his Forest Service career on the Pike and San Isabel National Forest in Colorado and the Comanche and Cimarron National Grasslands in Kansas. After serving as Deputy Forest Supervisor on the National Forests of North Carolina and the Mark Twain National Forest in Missouri, he became the Forest Supervisor on the Mark Twain. He then served as Regional Forester for the Eastern Region, headquartered in Milwaukee, Wisconsin for 5 years. Moore's national experience in Washington, D.C. includes serving as Acting Associate Deputy Chief of the National Forest System and as National Deputy Soils Program Manager. A native of Bastrop, Louisiana, Moore earned his bachelor's degree in Plant and Soil Science from Southern University. He has a wife. He and his wife, Antoinette, have 2 sons, a daughter, and 2 grandsons. And with that, welcome, Mr. Moore.
Thank you, and good morning. I just let me do a sound check to make sure that I'm coming across okay. Yes, okay, great. So, you know, it's really a pleasure to be able to come back and say a few words to you all. So thank you for the invitation. You know, as chief, I've been in this job for a couple of months now, and so I'm still learning the ropes. It seems like being able to talk to you all is like going home and having a conversation with people that you spent the last 14 years with. And so that's why, you know, this is surreal to me. And I'll just say before I even start, you know, because of all the activities that have been going on here in California the last few years, you know, as chief, one of the things that I really wanted to do was to be able to bring my executive team, and that's the executive team is all the deputy chief for National Forest System, deputy chief for state and private, my chief financial officer, deputy chief for research. It's all of my executive team. And so this week I had them all out here because I wanted them to be able to eyeball the devastation that has been taking place across the West, really, and specifically here in California. And you all wouldn't be surprised, but they certainly were surprised with the magnitude of what has been going on. And I really brought them out so that they would have that right mindset for doing something about what's taking place on the landscape. And so I thought it was really successful. We went up and spent quite a bit of time up in Northern California on the Dixie Fire. And later they also went in and looked at the Caldor Fire, just for context. And I had to scoot out and head over to Colorado. So I didn't finish up the week because I had another commitment over there. And so I just got back this morning from there to be able to have this conversation with you all. And so I'll say that, I'm also going to talk about this national picture just to give you some context. And then Jennifer is going to come in behind me to boil it down more to that local situation here in California. So as you all probably know, the Forest Service has a long history of working with local communities, and it's really getting at our mission to sustain the health, diversity, and productivity of the nation's forests and grasslands. And that includes about 154 national forests, which we just mentioned here. And in addition to that, about 20 national grasslands across the country. And altogether, about 193 million acres. And don't forget Puerto Rico also in that area. So, people get a lot of benefit from the lands that we manage, including timber, range, wildlife, wilderness, and even more. In terms of water supply alone, more than half of the surface runoff in the West, the entire West, comes from National Forest Systems lands. So I don't have to mention this to you all, but we're deeply committed to working with our state and local partners. If I go back to 1905 when the Forest Service was first created, it was created specifically to put boots on the ground in these communities that we serve, much like there in Tuolumne County. And so we have a long history of consulting with states, counties, local communities before we take major actions that really have an impact on them. And what that says, though, is this interdependence, which is a part of our core value as an agency, but also sharing the stewardship of these lands that's been entrusted to our care. And so sharing that stewardship with you all, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, but we're going to really focus on this area this year a little bit more than we have. So one of the Secretary's national priorities is looking at the economies in small rural communities. And I don't have to tell you all this either, but as you know, our economy suffered a pretty significant downturn this past year. But the Forest Service is doing its part to be responsive to that. And to give you an example, in 2019, the Forest Service activities across the nation supported more than 380,000 jobs. And it also contributed about $36 billion to the GDP, the gross domestic product. So when you compare that to our annual budget, which is just under $8 billion, you got about a $28 billion return for that $8 billion invested in caring for the land and serving people. So I would say that that's a pretty good return. And if I was to break that down a little bit more, about 35% comes from outdoor recreation, which supports about 154,000 jobs of that 380,000 that I mentioned. So pretty significant. Now, all of that took a hit this past year and this year because of COVID and because of wildfires. And as you've seen here in California, the last 2 years especially got so bad that we had to temporarily close our national forest so that we could help prevent some of the more ignitions that was taking place across the country. And sometimes, we can focus on our piece of land and wonder why are some decisions being made. But let me give you an example. This past year, the fire service in general responded to about 45,000 fires. And at one point, we had about 29,000 firefighters out trying to suppress a lot of the fire activity that was taking place just this summer alone. And so what you have is just significant issues on the land. And so if I had to say that another way, we had about 29,000 firefighters fighting about 110 large fires at one time. This was all across the West. And even though we had 29,000 firefighters, it wasn't enough. So our nation really is facing a wildfire crisis. and especially in the West. And, you know, being in Northern California, I don't have to tell you all that. If you just look at what happened in the past that's in your community, the Rim Fire, and when you fast forward, you know, looking at the Dixie Fire and the Caldor Fire this past year, and when you look back at it, over the past 20 years, we've seen growing fire sizes. We've seen some more extreme fire behavior. And these fire seasons has really grown into fire years. And looking at 2017 and 2018 fire years alone in California, some of these changes reinforced and expanded last year, and now this year again, and it's reached all across the West. We've seen fire behavior, record-shattering heat, tender dry fuels, stall weather fronts, hot and dry winds, lightning bust in unusual places, and all of that is really combining into starts of thousands of fires. And the thing about it, that these fires nowadays has a phenomenal rate of spread. So we're seeing record fire sizes and rates of spread from the West Coast to the Central Rockies. And give you an example, last year in Colorado, it had 3 of its largest wildfires on record, all in that one year. The August complex that was here in Northern California burned more than 1 million acres. Can you imagine that? 1 million acres. The Dixie Fire is right under 1 million acres. So mega fires like these are run across the vast landscapes and through what we call the wildland urban interface, which is the WUI areas. And, you know, areas that are normally too wet to burn went up in flames last year, like in the west side of the Cascades, up in the Northeast. Just unexpected behavior. I'll couple that now with the effects of smoke from wildfires. That's especially harsh, both for the firefighters, but also for the people that live in the communities that we serve. And, you know, I happen to live up in the Bay Area, out a ways around the Napa area. And so we have a real understanding of smoke. You know, we can put up with it for that first week, but after that, you know, it's just unbearable. And I say all that to say this: we have to do something different than what we're doing now, and we have to do something significantly more than what we're doing now. You know, but if you look back to how we got here, these changes was really rooted in a legacy of fuel buildup over the last 110 years. And when I look at the flyer that you have for this session, the TuCare session, I think it tells the story pretty well. You know, it starts with a photo of an open old growth ponderosa pine woodlands in the 1920s, you know, with people on horseback and under big trees scattered across the grassy landscape. Ponderosa pine was historically like that. You're looking anywhere between, you know, it varies, anywhere between 40 to 80 trees per acre. And what kept the landscape open was frequent low-intensity wildland fires. So starting in 1910, you know, America went to war against wildland fire. And the Forest Service had a policy of suppressing every wildland fire by the next morning after it was first detected. Some of y'all may know this as the 10 a.m. policy. And so, you know, the next photo really, and I'm using what you all have there because I think it tells a really good story. So that next photo, which is the second one, was shot back in the 1970s, 50 years later. And as you can see, there was a lot of trees coming up that you can barely see the person standing there. And then finally, fast forward from 1970 to 2020, you know, when the forest is filled with young trees, and we call that ladder fuels. And you all know this better than anyone. When that fire starts low, it has got fuel to climb up into the crown of the trees. And with a little wind with that, there's a recipe for disaster. And sometimes that's referred to as a perfect storm of the worst kind. So jumping back now, looking at our situation on the ground, our success over the last 100 years of fire suppression has helped to get us to where we are now. And while that was probably the right decision at that time, it's not the right decision now for this time. We have to do something different. So let me just say, you know, when I look at layering up things like fuel, when I look at the change in climate that we're going through now, you know, and you look at some of the examples that we mentioned, tens of millions of acres across the entire West are filled with dead and dying forests that are due to bark beetle epidemics, including, I think, we had about 148 million trees that were dead in the Sierras across California. That's evidence there. So you have to ask why. And a part of it, no matter where you stand on this issue of climate change, our climate is different now. And it has worsened the drought conditions that we're experiencing. And because we don't have the harsh winters that we used to have, where they would kill off some of the beetles in the wintertime. And what you have is just more beetles on the trees who don't have a lot of moisture to help squeeze them out. And what you have is an epidemic, which we've seen here in California. And we also see the same evidence throughout the entire West. So you have to ask the question, well, what can we do? The forested landscapes most at risk are in ponderosa pine and mixed conifer. And both of these are fire-adapted forest types. They evolved with frequent low-intensity wildfires, and guess what? Many forest landowners across the country adapted to the conditions that they found, and they used frequent fires to keep their forests open and healthy. I believe, I couldn't see who was talking earlier, but she gave you the perfect example of some of the tribal burning back in the past and how successful that had been up until we started managing the land and putting fires out. So, if you want to look at an example, is what's taking place in the South. The South still burns a lot. To further illustrate this, nationally, the Forest Service treats about, 3 million acres a year. About 1.5 million of that occurs in the South. And the vast majority of that is through prescribed burning. And so the communities there have adjusted to prescribed burning on a regular basis to help push back these nasty wildfires that we see out west. But after a century of fire exclusion, so we cannot just simply put fire back on the landscape, and nor can we do that anywhere in the West. Our fire-adapted forests are so overgrown and so unhealthy that we need to do some thinning first. We need to reduce the number of trees to something approaching the historical level. And you can just, look at it, it varies anywhere between 40 to 80 trees per acre. We have, in some cases, 300 trees per acre. And so we have to go in and do a lot more thinning and treating the landscape before we put fire back on there. And after we do the thinning, that's when we can run the low intensity fires through there. Now, that'll take a lot of active forest management as well. So a lot more than what we're doing currently, and a lot more strategically placed. So it's not just treating the landscape, but we need to be strategic about it, particularly if we're looking at protecting communities. Because just putting fire on the landscape is not going to work, and just going out doing treatment for the sake of treatment is not going to work either. So where can we strategically put these treatments on the landscape that protect communities, but also protect those values that the communities depends on in this infrastructure? We've been using the same tools and authorities for many years now, and in recent years, the Forest Service has treated up to what I mentioned earlier, 3 million acres. We have some really good examples here in Northern California, actually. When I look at the Caldor fire and how it was moving toward Lake Tahoe, we have spent a number of years treating all around Lake Tahoe. And when that fire it was just moving toward Lake Tahoe, and it was threatened. And when that fire hit those treated areas, though, the behavior completely changed and the fire died down, giving the firefighters a chance to get in there and to really evacuate the city, but also to look at knocking the fire down and moving it away from the city. We have a lot of evidence of that. I look at another example, just the opposite of that this week, and that was on the Dixie Fire, where it completely burned down the community of Greenville. We did not have the same level of treatments around the city of Greenville, the town of Greenville, as we did around Lake Tahoe. And so we have to be strategic in how we are treating the landscape, and we have to protect communities and also the infrastructure that those communities depend on. So I could go on giving you a lot of examples. We have many in Colorado. We have some in Arizona. But the bottom line to this, and the problem here, is that we don't have enough treatments at the scale that's needed. And these mega fires that we have been seeing in recent years have burned right through some of the smaller scale treatments. So if we don't go in and do large scale treatments, and you have a mega fire rolling through there, it's going to roll right through there and keep burning. So we have to increase the scale and the pace of treatments to match the scale and just the veracity of the fires that we're experiencing now. So we need to find the resources to ramp up the scale of our treatments to match the scale of the wildfire risk. Now, I know that Congressman McClintock is supposed to be on today. I'm assuming he still will be. But it's some of those tools that he had given around Lake Tahoe that helped save that town. You know, it was the 10,000 acre CE that they were allowed to use, but it could only be used in the Lake Tahoe area. If there was tools like that to be used on a more broader context, then I think that gives us a much better chance of saving a lot more of our small communities, much like what we have seen around South Lake Tahoe. So we need to work with partners to focus our treatments more strategically and at the scale of the problem, using the best available science as our guide. That's another way of saying that. And we should focus on fire sheds, which are large forested landscapes with high likelihood that an ignition could place homes, communities, and infrastructure at risk. I'll say that again. Focusing on fire sheds, which are large forested landscapes that have a high likelihood that an ignition could take place and also place homes, communities, and infrastructure at risk. So our strategy is to target the highest priority fire sheds first. The fire sheds most capable of generating large wildfire disasters. And the highest priority fire sheds for treatments are in fire-prone parts of Arizona, California, Colorado, Idaho, Oregon, and there are other Western states as well. You know, our scientists have mapped fire sheds across the nation in what we call the Fire Shed Registry. And this identifies fire sheds that are most at risk. And as you would imagine, there's quite a few here in California. And, you know, these fire sheds also include communities that are at risk from fires that start on national forests. And about 90% of the exposure to communities from national forest land, they really originate on about 15% of the total land area. And so now we're targeting these lands for treatments over the next 10 years. So we're guessing that even though there's about 6 to 6 million acres that needs to be treated, if we can strategically treat 20 million acres, we would have a positive effect on that whole 66. And so our goal over the next 10 years is to treat 20 million acres. Treating the fire shed most at risk deals on a national cohesive wildland fire management strategy. And so treating fire sheds meets the cohesive strategy of restoring fire adapted ecosystems on a landscape scale. You know, as we focus more just on community exposure to risk, it also meets the goal of building fire adapted human communities. And it helps firefighters respond safely and effectively to wildland fire, and which is our third goal in a cohesive strategy. So we envision full implementation of all cohesive strategy components, working collaboratively through shared stewardship with states, local communities, private landowners, as well as other stakeholders altogether. And I believe that we are positioned for success. Together with our partners, we have collaborative frameworks in place for cross-country, cross-boundary treatments, including cohesive strategy projects, shared stewardship agreements, joint chief staffs. You know, we've also signed a shared stewardship agreement with the state of California this past year. I believe it was this past August. And those are the types of tools that are going to give us the opportunity to work collaboratively and collectively together to treat the landscapes that are affecting all these communities that we live in. So bottom line is that we're all in this together. And so I'm asking that you help us ramp up the scale of our active forest management. No matter how many firefighters we hire or resources that we buy, we'll never suppress our way out of the wildfire crisis that we're experiencing now. Fire exclusion and fuel buildup put us into this mess. And the only way out is to reduce the fuels and then reintroduce low intensity fires that healthy fire adapted forests need. But we can't do it alone. You know, we're going to need people who live in our communities like yours, including public land managers and private landowners, sharing in the risk across landscapes, which goes back to my statements earlier. You know, we're going to have to sit down together and talk about what needs to happen on that landscape. And we need to bring all resources to bear to help increase the amount of work that we're currently doing. The work that's taking place out there is good work. It's just not nowhere near enough to make a positive difference on what's happening on the landscape. And then, you know, as we draw on sound science and using tools like the Fire Shit Registry, we need to place the right treatments in the right places at the right times and at the right scale. You know, like I said earlier, we're all in this together and we need to depend on each other to get it done. So the Forest Service is committed. We know that we have probably our best chance with some of the legislation that's being considered now in Congress. And we are hopeful that we'll have an opportunity to treat the 20 million acres over the next 10 years, because we know that if we're going to try to make a difference on that landscape, we have got to be much more active in our forest management. And it's not just about fire suppression. It's also trying to go in and do a lot more forest management, reducing the amount of trees and vegetation that's out there on these landscapes. And we also have an opportunity to use that as a jobs program as well in the process of doing that. So here again, we'll see what happens with some of the legislation that's being considered. But again, we have started putting a team together. I put a team together, and that team's sole purpose is to work with the different regions to look at prioritizing communities, and then what will it take to really put in just a real honest effort at reducing the danger and exposure of a lot of our communities. Because you all know as well as anyone, we need to do something different, and we need to do more of what we are doing now. That's how we're going to make our way out of this. So again, thank you all for just giving me the opportunity to come home and just to speak to you. And I look forward to hearing from you all to just see how we're doing from time to time. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Chief Moore. We certainly appreciate you coming into our community and being willing to share the vision of the Forest Service to get us out of the mess we're in. Thank you much. And I understand Jennifer is going to follow you now.
To follow me, Jennifer, are you on?
The technical difficulties, but we'll have her back here in a second.
Okay, do I need to hang up, or will I be able to listen in?
She's on a separate Zoom or connection, but will he be able to listen in? No, they're shaking their head no. Sorry.
Okay.
Technicalities. All right.
Well,
All right. Okay, next we're going to hear from Jennifer Eberlein, who is the Region 5 Forester for the U.S. Forest Service. Jennifer Eberlein, Region 5 Forester for the U.S. Forest Service, oversees 18 forests in California, including 20 million acres, covering the North Coast, Cascade and Sierra Ranges, and Big Sur to the Mexican border in the South Coast Range. Additionally, she will oversee private forestry programs in Hawaii, U.S. affiliated Pacific Islands. Sounds a lot like Randy's last job, doesn't it? Because it was. She was the assistant there, and now she's moved up to the forester. An agency veteran with nearly 30 years of land management experience, Ms. Eberlein was previously stationed in Washington, D.C., where she served as an associate deputy chief for the National Forest System. Ms. Eberlein started her career with the Forest Service in 1992 in Park Falls, Wisconsin. I will not try to pronounce the name of that national forest. She was since served as Deputy Forest Supervisor for the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest in southwest Oregon Forest Supervisor on the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest in Everett, Washington, and Deputy Regional Forester for the Pacific Southwest region in Vallejo, California. Ms. Eberlein also served a year as Acting Regional Forester for the Rocky Mountain region, headquartered in Denver, Colorado. Ms. Eberlein is a graduate of University of Minnesota with a bachelor's degree in anthropology. She also holds a master's degree in anthropology from Northern Arizona University. I knew how to say Snoqualmie because I'm from Washington. So, Ms. Eberlein, here you are.
Thank you, everybody. Doing a sound check. Can you hear me okay? Okay, thank you for the head nods. I appreciate that. Just want to say good afternoon, and so thank you for the invitation to speak with all of you today. And I do know that our Chief Moore just was on prior to me, and he's always a tough act to follow, believe me, both speaking immediately after him and filling in behind him his shoes as regional forester here in the Pacific Southwest region. But it is an honor to follow him today, but with you all as well as in the position. And I kind of make a joke that I'm the new and improved Randy Moore, and I'm coming in with heels. So just heads up, everybody. So, and we're also very lucky to have someone leading the agency who really understands California, our challenges here, as well as the forests in our communities. So very happy to have him aboard as Chief Moore. I'm very happy also to be back in California. As you very nicely said in the introduction, I have been here for 6 years. I have about almost 30 years in public land management. I worked for the Forest Service majority of those years, and then also had some time with the Bureau of Land Management. And I spent 4 years as the Deputy Regional Forester here, working for our now Chief Moore as when he was Regional Forester. So worked all over the country, and like I said, very happy to be back in California after stepping away for a couple of years, almost 2 years, doing some other assignments, as was said in the intro. Just before we start too, I do want to acknowledge that I know, if I'm understanding right, there's a couple of people that are missing here today, and certainly want to recognize Glenn Gottschall from our Fire Safe Council, who also has a long history with the Forest Services Way. I think he was going to present later today, as well as Randy Hanfeld, who would be emceeing for us. I believe they both had some health-related issues, so please keep both of them in your thoughts today. Again, happy to be on here with video. I am really looking forward to meeting people in person soon and engaging with you guys directly as partners. So put a placeholder for some in-person engagement, hopefully coming soon. So we're just still working through our agency position on some of the travel and everything. So thank you for being flexible and still allowing both Chief Moore and myself to join virtually. And I'm really looking forward to meeting and talking with all of you, because the work that Tuolumne County is doing is just exemplary for us. And the region is committed, under previous as well as my leadership, to working with you to really restore and maintain and have those resilient forests and the forest lands that provide so much for us, for all of us collectively, natural resources and economic benefits to our communities. So as you know, and I'm sure that Chief Moore described the national look, but as you guys know, this has been another extremely challenging year for fire, with over 8,200 fires in the state of California alone, almost as many as 2020, which was a record-setting fire season for us. These fires have burned this year almost 3 million acres across California. And then coupled with last year, we have almost 7 million acres in the state of California alone burned. So we are definitely into post-fire recovery and planning and looking collectively with everybody, what does that look like for the state? Hopefully Chief Moore had mentioned that he was very, I think, directive in the sense of bringing his executive leadership team out here last week, or earlier this week actually, to look at the state that we have in California, and also understand that other parts of the country are in the same post-fire recovery realm that we have not been in before. The size and the scale of the need, and balancing our post-fire black area treatments with still maintaining that green infrastructure to maintain the green resiliency that we have on the landscape too. So still lots of conversation and discussion and planning, and the joint planning that we'll need to have on that. But that's certainly one of our top priorities in this region, And for me, is making sure we're looking at post-fire and fuels treatments, and how do we protect our communities and our values that we have on the land. Again, I think the chief listed many reasons for these unprecedented large fires, the extreme fire behavior that we're seeing, a century of fire suppression coupled with drought. I had no idea there was another word beyond extreme drought, and now we're in exceptional drought. I hope we don't have to have another scaled word to describe what's happening in the West, and particularly in California. So we've had drought, insects, other factors, and just to highlight how dry the state is right now, just days after the end of the water year, Sacramento has now recorded 6 months with no measurable precipitation, and that's the first time that has occurred since 1880. So we're in the exceptional stage, definitely. But I know that we have, I certainly have hope. We have some successes that we need to build off of. And certainly working in the collaborative environment and experience that you guys all have, what we can learn from you, what we learn together, and how we can look across the state, as well as Tuolumne County. How can we work together to work through these big problems that we have? So when you look around your meeting room and when you see everybody sitting there and you see all the best and the brightest minds working together, we can change this trajectory. It's going to take time, resources, and attention, but we can do it. Not only for the past few years that everybody's been working together, but we need to start changing what's been happening in the past 100 years. Not a light lift, not a small challenge, but I certainly am one that works towards that goal, with that end goal in mind, and looking at all the successes that we've had. And as the chief noted, that he really was saying how shared stewardship is how we will do business, how we have been doing business. It's absolutely will take all of us to be able to face the challenges that we have in front of us. But again, there's some success stories that we can build off of. So the work of the Tree Mortality Task Force, the Forest Management Task Force throughout the state led to more collaboration, and more important, to that local input, such as counties, our fire safe councils, our resource conservation districts. That input is critical for us, that on the ground knowledge that all of you have, that we have in many of our counties across the state. It's absolutely critical for all of us to be successful. This collaboration continues with Governor Newsom's establishment of the Wildfire and Forest Resilience Task Force. And I'm very proud to follow Chief Moore as the co-chair of this latest iteration of the California Task Forces, alongside with Natural Resources Secretary Wade Crowfoot. So we're focused on implementation of an action plan that's been built upon the work of the previous task forces, and then also looking at some other progress that we have worth noting as well. So as a society, we are beginning to accept and understand and use the fact that people have understood natural processes for thousands of years. Tribes have practiced prescribed fire, managed fire long before the first missionaries and the miners came to California. So we must use the traditional ecological knowledge of tribes in conjunction with modern science and technology to really make some movement on the landscape. Right here on the Stanislaus National Forest, agency partners are working with research scientists to develop models for scenario planning and priority setting to be used in Tuolumne County and across the state. The state of California is investing in LiDAR data and technology as part of the substantial appropriations for fire, forestry, and community hardening at about $1.5 billion this year alone. So using this technology will ensure that we spend our dollars wisely in the right places at the right scales. And the chief also explained, I believe, how fire sheds analysis that we're working on at a national level are really helping inform where to make those targeted investments and treatments that protect communities, infrastructure, and watersheds. So we're looking at all of those factors. Another big area of progress on both the state and federal sides has been around what has been called analysis paralysis. In 2018, the state passed Senate Bill 901. That law eliminated the need to do CEQA, the state's equivalent to NEPA, our environmental analysis process at the federal level. So they eliminated the need to do Sql analysis on federal lands for spray activities if NEPA had already been completed. So this is good governance for all of us, saving the cost of analysis and the time of expert analysis. Congress and the Forest Service has responded to the state's entry on that as well. So in this region, we use categorical exclusions, or CEs, for our environmental analysis on about 80% of our NEPA documents. Congress also granted us the 10,000 acre CE, or categorical exclusion authority, in the Tahoe Basin. Thank you very much, Congressman McClintock. Be great to see that expanded to other parts. And we will look and test and use that in the basin to help people understand how valuable that CE is. Another success story, through better public involvement, early engagement, and working with our collaboratives, we actually see fewer project lawsuits than we did in the past. So as the chief noted, we've got many authorities available to us. The region is committed to using as many and all the tools that we have possible, from good neighbor agreements to other types of agreements and authorities that we have to work with our states, counties, and our tribes. So I'm committed to using all of the tools in the toolbox to get work done in Tuolumne County and across the state. I know the chief has certainly invited you to join us to help increase our active forest management. And we really need to work together to reduce fuels at a much larger scale, using mechanical thinning, using prescribed fire where and when it's appropriate. So I really look forward to walking with all of you to get to our resilient forests and communities. And I'll just end by thank you so much for the opportunity to join you today. And I really look forward to future engagements.
And thank you much for sharing your insights on this. We look forward to it too. Congratulations on the new job, and hope it all goes well for you. All right. I guess we're done. Okay, our next speaker, our keynote speaker, really needs no introduction in this community. Anybody who's paid any attention to politics in California or the U.S. Congress in the last 30 years knows Tom McClintock and the great job he's doing. He's going to be addressing regulatory reform now, and I'll read his bio here quick. Tom McClintock represents the people of California's historic gold country in Sierra Nevada in a district that stretches from Lake Tahoe through Yosemite Valley and on to Kings Canyon. Often described as the gold standard for fiscal conservatism in Congress, the National Taxpayers Union rated him as the best vote for taxpayers in the House 4 times, most recently in 2020. Citizens Against Government Waste recently named him one of only 2 perfect votes in the House, fighting wasteful government spending. Yes. McClintock is a member of the House Judiciary Committee, where he serves as ranking member of the Subcommittee on Immigration and Citizenship, also serves on the Subcommittee on the Constitution, Civil Rights, and Civil Liberties. He is a senior member of the House Natural Resources Committee, where he serves on the Subcommittee on National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands, which he chaired from 2015 to 2018, and on the Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife, which he chaired from 2011 to 2015. The congressman is also a member of the House Budget Committee and has proposed major fiscal reforms to curb unauthorized appropriations, control mandatory spending, balance budgets, and protect the nation's credit. Prior to his election to the U.S. Congress, McClintock served 22 years in the California legislature, where he became one of the most recognized conservative leaders. He twice received the Republican nomination for state controller. What a bullet we missed there. What a solution we missed there. Narrowly missing it one time by 23 1/100%. We would have been, would have been great. He ran as a conservative standard bearer for the governor in California's historic recall in 2003. Tom and his wife Lori married in 1987 and have 2 children. Tom, come on up and elucidate again for us.
Well, thank you for that introduction. I want to thank all of you for not only for being here today, but for all of the work that you've done over so many years to raise public awareness of the importance, in fact, the imperative of active forest management and sensible resource management, and for charting a path to return to the policies that once protected our forests and prospered our local communities and generated revenues for our local governments. You know, the frustrating thing is that we had all of that once. This is not a theoretical discussion. We know how to manage the forest. We did so expertly for nearly 100 years. And in a period of just a few years, back in the 1970s, this was all thrown away, sacrificed on the altar of the green left. You know, you were warning of the disastrous effect of these 1970s era laws and policies since you formed. In fact, you formed specifically to warn the public about the damage that these policies were doing to our forests. And for this, you were vilified by the left and by their mouthpieces in the media. You remember those days. The damage they were doing was hard to get people to grasp because the effects of abandoning our forests to benign neglect happen very slowly over a number of years. They happen silently, year by year, as morbid overgrowth gradually began to choke off the forests. Well, we've now lived with those laws for nearly 50 years, and the damage of these policies should now be obvious to anyone who takes a glance at our forests. It's easy to see, but it is somewhat harder to understand, to truly understand it. We need to go back to the days before active forest management, before Western civilization. Paleontologists tell us that before the last half of the 19th century, California lost between 4 and 12 million acres a year to catastrophic fire. 4 to 12 million acres a year. You see, that's how nature gardens. If you doubt that, just abandon your own garden for a few months, let alone for 50 years, and see what happens to it. Nature is a lousy gardener. An untended forest is no different than an untended garden. It will grow and grow and grow until it chokes itself to death, and then it will fall victim to disease, pestilence, drought, and ultimately catastrophic wildfire. And we have to keep reminding people that excess timber is going to come out of the forest one way or another. Either we will carry it out or nature will burn it out, but either way, it will come out. That's how nature does its gardening. In fact, when Juan Cabrillo dropped anchor in Santa Monica Bay, it was October 1542. Any of you from Southern California, you know what October means. It's the Santa Ana fire season. Almost 500 years ago, Cabrillo, the first European to set eyes on the coast of California, promptly named Santa Monica Bay the Bay of Smoke. Now, at the turn of the last century, we formed the U.S. Forest Service and gave it a very simple mission. Do a little gardening in our national forests. Carry out the excess timber before it can destroy the forests. And at the same time, we suppressed brush growth. We encouraged grazing. Every year, U.S. Forest Service foresters would mark off excess timber, and they'd auction it off to the highest bidder. Logging companies paid us, the federal government, to remove that timber. That made us money. 25% of the proceeds went right into the coffers of local governments that are affected by the public lands. Local governments like Tuolumne County, 25% of the timber auctions every year went into our local coffers. The other 75% went to the Forest Service and was used to improve our forests. And throughout the 20th century, that worked. The acreage lost to wildfire dropped dramatically from between 4 and 12 million acres a year to a very steady 1/4 million acres a year. The fires that did get out of control stayed out of the crowns. We had good timber roads providing emergency access to all parts of the forest to get equipment to a fire at once. Often, excuse me, logging equipment was close by to cut the fire breaks necessary in the event of an emergency. Timber killed by fire was quickly salvaged while it still had commercial value. And once again, the proceeds were put back into our local governments and were used to replant the ravaged land before the brush could lay first claim to it. And this era of active forest management worked. It assured healthy and resilient forests for every generation to enjoy. It produced a cornucopia of commerce for our mountain communities, as well as a steady stream of revenues for our local governments. So I have just one question. Why, in God's name, did we throw all of that away? Well, you know why. Leftist environmental groups arose, not from our mountain communities, but from the cities, and they discovered they could raise a lot of money and attract a lot of votes from hopelessly well-intentioned but virtually clueless followers in our urban areas. They won a sweeping series of laws in the early 1970s, including the National Environmental Policy Act and the Endangered Species Act. They forced our experienced foresters in our land management agencies out of those agencies in favor of zealots who were determined to remove mankind from the management of our forests. And they succeeded. Today, these laws require an average of 4 years just to prepare the environmental impact statements before a forest management project can even begin. Endless lawsuits can draw out that time indefinitely. They cost millions of dollars to produce, more than the commercial value of the timber that we once sold. So instead of making the government money so that we could put it back into the land in our local communities, these projects end up consuming our forest management dollars. Now, as you all know, after a fire, a clock starts running on the salvage value of the dead trees. On a fast track, it now takes a year for the environmental review for timber salvage, usually much longer than that. And by then, of course, the timber's lost most of its salvage value. All you have to do is draw that out another year by filing a nuisance lawsuit or bureaucratic slow walking. It's got no value at all. So you can go ahead and put it out for bid. Nobody's going to buy it. Meanwhile, grazing is one of the most effective measures to control brush growth. Yet we've watched the same environmental laws and regulations used to discourage grazing through the national forest through a variety of different methods: above-market grazing fees, excessive liability exposure for ranchers, and when that fails, just outright harassment. A few years ago, we dealt with an issue in the Tahoe National Forest. The Leavell family had been running cattle through there since 1931. And by all accounts, they had been excellent and responsible stewards of the land. With absolutely no warning, the Forest Service presented them with a letter declaring that they were in non-compliance because of cattle that occasionally stray off the land. Yet in the past, federal regulations prohibited them from building fences to prevent that very problem, and it turns out the cows can't read very well. Or if they can read, they really don't care. The Forest Service recently charged that the cattle were damaging aspen stands, allegations that further inspection proved to be groundless. So having failed to make its case on those grounds, the Forest Service came back and ordered the Leavells to remove cabins that they've maintained and paid property taxes on for 79 years. We had another family, the Coughlin family. It also had its long-standing grazing permit canceled because of a lack of sufficient feed, as determined by a Forest Service biologist. Well, a subsequent field trip utterly disproved the biologist's opinion, so the Forest Service next simply informed them their permit's still in jeopardy because of the same wandering cows that it used as a pretense in the Leavell's case. I recently saw an estimate that at present, we are only removing about 5% of the annual growth of our forests. 5%. Now think about that. If I delivered 20 newspapers to your house every day, and you only threw away one of those newspapers every day, How long would it take your home to become a fire trap? That's the condition of our forest today. The left now tells us, well, this isn't a lack of proper forest management, it's climate change. Their all-purpose go-to excuse for all of the damages that their policies have done over so many different sectors. Climate change. Well, again, remember, when Cabrillo noted the wildfires in 1542, the Earth was in a period that's well documented as the Little Ice Age. In that period, the Thames froze over every year, so thick that they used to hold an annual ice festival on it. Now, the climate is gradually warming, but any real climatologist will tell you that means more overall precipitation, not less. What we're dealing with are changing weather patterns. When climate change, you can now often tell the exact boundary lines between the public and private lands just on the condition of the forests on each side of that line. You can see it clearly from the air. How clever of the climate to know the exact boundary lines between the private and public lands and only decimate the public lands. I've got a memo to Mr. Newsom and Mr. Biden. If you actually think that if we all turn off our air conditioning and heating and all ride our bikes to work, that this problem is going away, you are completely out of your mind. 5 years after the King Fire, I toured the footprint by helicopter. The line between the private SPI property and the national forest, you could see absolutely precisely. On the SPI property, all the fire-killed timber had been removed. Young growing trees had been planted and were flourishing. On the national forest land, it had been completely abandoned. The blackened trees still stood there, drying out, ready to fall over on between 6 and 8 feet of brush that had grown up in the meantime, creating a perfect fire stack for a second-generation fire. In fact, we saw that graphically demonstrated during the Dixie Fire. The Dixie Fire burned over a portion of the Reading Fire from about 15 years ago that had been abandoned after the fire. The brush had grown up. The great trees started falling over on top of it, so you now had 6 feet of tinder with big dry logs on the top. When the fire hit that neglected land, it absolutely exploded. These laws and the endless regulations promulgated by them have got to change. And until they do, we will continue to watch our precious forests and our forest communities consumed by this final act of nature's cycle of destruction. And anyone who's waiting for the renewal part of that cycle will wait an exceedingly long time, since brush takes first claim on these lands and the forests take centuries to regrow. And you can see that across the Sierra of the forest, of the fire-ravaged lands that we've built up over these past 15 years. I imagine you could use some good news at this point, so let me offer this. First, public opinion is changing. People are realizing that these laws and regulations that promise to improve our forest environment for the last 50 years have been a lie. You can see that lie so clearly every time you look at our forests. As Chief Moore mentioned, 5 years ago, I was able to get into the Wind Act of 2016 provisions of my bill to provide the categorical exclusion from NEPA for forest thinning projects up to 10,000 acres. In order to get it past the Senate, we did have to limit it to the Tahoe Basin. But it has been implemented in the Tahoe Basin, and it has proven an enormous success. The largest timber thinning projects in recent decades are now being done under this new authority. It's taken the environmental review from these projects from 4 years down to just 4 months. It's reduced reports from 800 pages down to just a dozen or so. And it was used effectively around South Lake Tahoe. As Chief Moore mentioned, when the Caldor fire hit the patches that were treated, it lay down, it slowed, and it was extinguished. Now, the forest supervisor who actually implemented this law in the Tahoe Basin is now the forest supervisor for the El Dorado Forest, And he's begging for these provisions to be extended to his forest as well. Now, he was begging in the months that preceded the disastrous Caldor fire that's still burning right now. And I've introduced legislation every session to extend the provisions of this bill now that they have been proven a success. I have to tell you, at present, we can't even get a hearing before the House Natural Resources Committee. This is a bill that 5 years ago passed with bipartisan support in both houses and was signed by Barack Obama. The Congress has become so radicalized in the intervening time, we can't even get a hearing on it. But I can tell you this with increasing confidence. That's going to change 542 days from now. Not that I'm counting. You know, in the spring of 2013, I worked with Randy Moore when he was regional forester to raise the fuels reduction target by 8 million board feet, and he was very anxious to do that. This was because of the heavily overgrown status of the Stanislaus National Forest that was first pointed out by Supervisor Randy Hanville. He called it a disaster waiting to happen, and indeed it was. On August 17, 2013, the Rim Fire erupted. Ultimately, it burned about 260,000 acres. And the supreme irony is this: Randy was not able to do that increase in board feet thinning because he was stopped by environmentalist lawsuits that were supposed to protect the spotted owl. And the irony is that when the Rim Fire came through, because we couldn't treat the forest earlier, it destroyed 46 of those spotted owl sanctuaries. Before the Rim Fire was out, we did a helicopter survey of the damage, and I asked Randy, what's needed to expedite salvage? And he said the only path that he could see was legislation, which is I introduced. Meanwhile, the Forest Service did everything practicable to expedite NEPA, bringing all the experts throughout Region 5 to speed the process. And at the same time, TuCare and local community leaders brought together a diverse group of stakeholders to consult and hopefully prevent lawsuit challenges to NEPA for the salvage. As I said, the Forest Service did get the EIS done in an amazing one-year time frame, but it was challenged in court. Some salvage occurred, but not nearly what could have been. And the value of that timber used for reforestation could have been used for reforestation had salvage started immediately, as was done on the private SPI lands. And then there's another issue, and that is the let burn policy of the Forest Service. On July the 4th, lightning struck a tree in the Humboldt-Toyabe National Forest in Alpine County. It ignited a small fire that smoldered for days in about a quarter acre of rugged terrain. According to Sheriff Rick Stevens, California's firefighting agency, CAL FIRE, dispatched a crew to put it out. But they were told to stand down by the U.S. Forest Service, which proceeded to monitor the situation instead. Monitor, that means do precisely nothing. They did send a helicopter over every day to take pictures for their Facebook, but they didn't bother to drop any water from that helicopter. 12 days later, the Tamarack fire exploded out of control, consumed 70,000 acres, destroyed 23 homes, and did about $8.7 million of damage. And again, one of the ironies of this is that one of the towns in the path of the Tamarack fire was Woodford's, California. In 1987, they had exactly the same problem. The Woodford's Fire Department responded to a report of fire on Forest Service land near their town, and they too were turned away. Federal officials threatened Woodford residents with arrest for even trying to extinguish the small blaze on Forest Service land. Hours later, the fire exploded to 6,500 acres, costing 25 families their homes. This let burn policy began the same time we got NEPA and ESA in 1972, during the height of the radical environmental movement. Essentially, it holds that fire is our friend. If fire comes through and ravages a forest, that is then classified as treated land for the future. In 1998, when this federal let burn policy produced the disastrous Yellowstone fires, President Reagan reversed it. In fact, at a press conference, he said, I didn't even know this policy existed. The minute that this happened out there, and Don Hodel, the Interior Secretary, went out there, he made it plain that no, we're withdrawing from that policy. And we did. The problem is, Reagan left, and the policy returned, and the devastation that it's caused since then is tragic, avoidable, and incalculable. It is absolutely dangerous nonsense to monitor incipient fires in today's forest tinderbox, even if they seem to pose no immediate danger. No person in his right mind would monitor a rattlesnake curled up in his bedroom because it wasn't doing anything at the moment. He'd kill it before it does. But this is where enlightened leadership can play a role, and where even without legislative change, regulatory change can be effected within the bureaucracy. We're very fortunate that our Region 5 supervisor, Randy Moore, was promoted like the next week to Chief of the U.S. Forest Service. And one of his first acts as chief was to rescind the let burn order and instead to order initial attacks on all fires the moment they're spotted, at least for this season. So what I can leave you with is this. What you're doing matters. Public opinion is slowly turning in our direction, propelled by your good work and the mounting evidence that people can see with their own eyes. I cannot tell you that legislative change will occur this year, but I do have a high degree of confidence that we will see that change in the next Congress. And the more we can bring pressure to bear on the land management bureaucracies, the faster we can return to the days of resilient forests, fire-safe communities, and prospering mountain economies. Thank you all very much for everything you're doing. Just keep doing it.
Well, thank you, Tom. We have a panel of our own, group of scientists working on some cloning, and we figure if we get 533 more of you, we can probably take over the Congress. Sheesh. We need to make it happen. Huh? That's good. That's good. Common sense is prevailing. Well, Tom is our last speaker, so let's give all our speakers a round of applause. We also need to give a special round of applause for Melinda Fleming. She is the executive director of TuCare. She and her crew, believe me, without Melinda's energy, drive, commitment to our cause, and just flat-out hard work, events like this would be hard to put together. Thank you, Melinda. Thank you much. And for yesterday's tour, too. So in conclusion, the question asked to be asked at the end of this program, the big question is, what happens next? You know, we've shared and heard a lot of good information today, but if it doesn't result in work getting done across the landscape to reduce fuels and fire hazard, it will be for naught. We know what needs to be done. Each of us has a responsibility. Each one of us has a part to play. We must make it happen. Let's do it. Thank you much. Thanks for coming.